At its peak, the Mali Empire was one of the largest and wealthiest empires in the world, controlling vast swaths of West Africa. Its rulers were not only feared and respected across the continent, but their wealth and influence extended as far as Europe and the Middle East. The most famous of these rulers, Mansa Musa, is still remembered for his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century, an event so spectacular that it changed the course of history. But how did a small kingdom on the edge of the Sahara grow into an empire of such grandeur? And what happened to it? The story of the Mali Empire is a tale of rise and fall, of extraordinary leaders, cultural flourishing, and the complex forces that shaped its destiny. The story of the Mali Empire begins long before the empire itself was officially founded, in a region rich in trade, culture, and historical significance. To understand the rise of the Mali Empire, we must first look at the early foundations of West Africa and the complex societies that existed there. The area that would later become the heart of the Mali Empire was home to several ancient civilizations and powerful kingdoms. These early societies developed along the Niger River, which flows through present-day Mali and several other countries in West Africa. The river provided a critical link between different regions, facilitating trade, communication, and cultural exchange across vast distances. In the centuries before the establishment of the Mali Empire, the river valleys of the Sahel, a region south of the Sahara, were home to vibrant communities that relied on agriculture, fishing, and trade. These communities were connected by well-established networks that allowed them to exchange goods like salt, gold, ivory, and textiles. As early as the 3rd century BCE, various kingdoms and tribal groups had settled in the region, forming the backbone of the societies that would later contribute to the rise of the Mali Empire. The Kingdom of Ghana, located to the north of what would become Mali, was one of the first major powers in West Africa. By the 8th century CE, Ghana had grown into a wealthy and powerful kingdom, benefiting from its control over key trade routes, particularly the trans-Saharan trade that linked West Africa with North Africa and the Mediterranean world. Ghana's prosperity was built on the trade of gold, salt, and other valuable commodities. However, by the 11th century, the Kingdom of Ghana began to weaken due to internal conflicts and external pressures, including invasions from the Almoravid Berber tribes from the north. As Ghana's power waned, new kingdoms began to rise, setting the stage for the emergence of Mali. One of the most important early civilizations in the region was the Kingdom of Kangaba, situated in the area that would later become the core of the Mali Empire. The people of Kangaba, known as the Malinka, were part of a larger ethnic group that would play a significant role in the formation of the empire. The Malinka had a strong warrior tradition and a deep cultural connection to the land, which would become key factors in their rise to power. It was in this environment, shaped by the decline of Ghana, the rise of smaller states, and the shifting political landscape of West Africa, that the foundations of the Mali Empire began to take shape. By the early 13th century, the region was experiencing both political fragmentation and new opportunities for expansion. This was the moment when a series of key events and figures would come together to lay the groundwork for one of Africa's greatest empires. At the center of this transformative period was the rise of the Malinka warrior and leader Sundiata Keita, whose story is intertwined with the founding of the Mali Empire. But before we delve into Sundiata's story, it's important to understand the broader context of the Sahel and West Africa during this time. The Sahel, a vast region of semi-arid land stretching across the northern part of West Africa, was home to several important cultures and trade networks. The cities and kingdoms that flourished here were diverse, with different languages, religions, and social structures. By the 12th century, the Sahel had become a melting pot of various influences, including traditional African beliefs, Arab and Berber traders, and the spread of Islam. Islam had been introduced to the region through trade and conquest, and by the early 13th century, it had begun to take root among many of the powerful states in West Africa. The religion would later play a crucial role in shaping the cultural and political identity of the Mali Empire. However, the spread of Islam was a gradual process, and many of the rulers of early Mali were still practicing traditional African religions when the empire was first formed. In the midst of this cultural and political fluidity, the figure of Sundiata Keita would emerge as a unifying force for the people of the Malinka. Sundiata was born in approximately the year 1200 in the region of Kangaba. He came from a royal family, but his early life was marked by hardship. According to oral tradition, Sundiata's mother, Sogalon, was a woman of great wisdom and strength, but his father, King Konaré, faced difficulties in producing a strong heir. Sundiata's early years were marked by challenges, including physical disabilities that led many to doubt his future as a leader. Despite these early struggles, Sundiata's story is one of perseverance. When his father died, Sundiata's half-brother, the cruel and ambitious king Sumanguru, seized the throne. Sumanguru, a member of the Soso people, ruled with a harsh hand and was determined to maintain his control over the region. Under his rule, many people suffered, and Sundiata was forced into exile. During his years in exile, Sundiata gained valuable experience and support from various neighboring tribes. He was known for his intelligence, charisma, and ability to inspire loyalty among his followers. His time away from the throne gave him a unique perspective on leadership, and when the opportunity arose to challenge Sumanguru's rule, Sundiata returned to fight for the throne of his ancestors. In 1235, Sundiata led an alliance of Malinka warriors and neighboring tribes in the Battle of Kirina, a decisive confrontation that would change the course of West African history. The Battle of Kirina was a turning point in the struggle between the Malinke and the Soso. Sundiata's forces defeated Sumanguru, and with his victory, he established the foundation of the Mali Empire. This victory was not just a military triumph, but a symbolic one. It marked the beginning of a new era for the Malinka people and set the stage for the creation of one of Africa's most powerful and enduring empires. Following his victory, Sundiata was hailed as the founder of the Mali Empire, and he became the first ruler, or Mansa, of the new kingdom. Under Sundiata's leadership, Mali began to consolidate its power. He established a strong central government, organized the empire into provinces, and laid the foundations for an economy based on trade and agriculture. Sundiata also promoted the spread of Islam, although he did not force his people to convert. Instead, he encouraged peaceful coexistence between the various religious groups within the empire, which included both Muslims and practitioners of traditional African beliefs. The foundation of the Mali Empire is inextricably linked to the life and rise of one remarkable leader, Sundiata Keita. While his victory at the Battle of Kirina in 1235 is often regarded as the moment the Mali Empire was born, his journey to power is one of remarkable perseverance, personal transformation, and strategic brilliance. To understand the lasting impact of the Mali Empire, we must first explore the life of the man who laid the empire's first stones. Born around the year 1217, Sundiata's early life seemed destined to defy expectations. He was born into the royal family of the Kingdom of Kangaba, an important regional power, but his story was marked by struggle. His mother, Sogalon, was a woman of great wisdom, yet her son, Sundiata, was initially not considered strong or capable of ruling. He was reported to have been physically disabled during his early years, unable to walk or speak for a time. His condition made many doubt his future as a leader, yet his determination and unique qualities would defy the odds. The story of Sundiata's rise to prominence is often told through oral tradition, passed down through generations in the form of epic tales. The Sundiata epic, which recounts his journey, presents Sundiata not only as a political leader but as a figure embodying perseverance, intelligence, and deep ties to the land and people of Mali. His early struggles, however, were not limited to his health. After the death of his father, King Konaré, Sundiata's half-brother, the ambitious and ruthless Sumanguru, seized the throne of the Kingdom of Kangaba, leading to a harsh and unjust reign. Sumanguru, a member of the Soso ethnic group, ruled with cruelty, sparking widespread discontent. Sumanguru's rule was characterized by terror. He was not only an aggressive and oppressive ruler, but also believed in using magic and superstition to maintain control. Many people lived in fear under his rule, and his reign would become one of the most hated periods in the region's history. For Sundiata, this was a time of exile and hardship. The young prince was forced to flee with his mother and close relatives, driven out of his homeland by Sumanguru's tyranny. Yet it was during this period of exile that Sundiata's leadership qualities began to fully develop. While in exile, Sundiata was not idle. He traveled widely, gaining experience, forming alliances, and learning the intricacies of leadership. His exile would also prove to be a time of reflection, allowing him to come to terms with the political realities of his time. Sundiata's time away from the throne was, paradoxically, what gave him the wisdom and skills he would need to become a great ruler. He gathered followers, many of whom had suffered under Sumanguru's regime, and he developed a deep understanding of military strategy and governance. It was clear that Sundiata had become more than just a prince in exile. He had become the symbol of resistance to Sumanguru's brutal rule. In the early 30s, the opportunity to reclaim his birthright finally came. The political and military landscape of West Africa was changing. Sumanguru's hold on power was beginning to weaken, and many of the kingdoms that had once been under his rule started to seek alternatives. The Malinka people, the ethnic group to which Sundiata belonged, began to rally around him. With the support of neighboring tribes and dissidents from Sumanguru's own forces, Sundiata prepared for a decisive confrontation. In 1235, the long-awaited moment arrived. Sundiata led a coalition of Malinka warriors, along with various allies from other ethnic groups, into battle against Sumanguru's army. The Battle of Kirina, fought on the banks of the Sankarani River, would become one of the most important battles in West African history. It was not only a military victory, but a defining moment in the rise of the Mali Empire. Sundiata's forces, though fewer in number, were better led and more strategically positioned. The battle was fierce, with both sides fighting with intense determination. According to the Sundiata epic, the tide of battle turned when Sundiata's forces overwhelmed Sumanguru's troops. Sumanguru, unable to withstand the defeat, fled the battlefield, marking the end of his reign and the beginning of a new era for the Malinka people. With Sumanguru's defeat, the Mali Empire was born. The victory at Kirina was monumental, but it was only the beginning of Sundiata's challenges. The newly established empire needed to be consolidated, and Sundiata understood that creating a strong and lasting state would require not just military strength, but also strategic diplomacy and administrative reforms. Upon assuming leadership, Sundiata immediately set to work organizing the empire into a functioning polity. He divided the empire into provinces, each governed by a loyal and trusted official. This decentralized system allowed for local autonomy while still maintaining the central power of the emperor. Sundiata's political reforms were critical in laying the foundations for the Mali Empire. One of his first actions was to establish a legal system based on customary law, known as Kurukan Fuga. This code of law outlined the rights and responsibilities of the people within the empire and helped to ensure justice and order. The code also emphasized fairness, cooperation, and mutual respect among the different ethnic groups within the empire. Sundiata's approach to governance was rooted in the principle of unity, and he worked tirelessly to create a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state that could coexist peacefully despite its diversity. Sundiata's reign also marked the beginning of Mali's expansion. With the defeat of Sumanguru, Sundiata began the process of unifying various Malinka clans and neighboring regions under the banner of the new empire. He sought to incorporate the territories of the Kingdom of Kangaba, as well as neighboring states and cities, into his empire. By the time of his death, the Mali Empire had become one of the largest and most powerful states in West Africa, encompassing vast territories stretching from the Senegal River to the Niger River. As the empire expanded, so did its influence in trade. Mali's strategic location along the trans-Saharan trade routes allowed it to become a central hub for commerce between North Africa, Europe, and sub-Saharan Africa. Trade in gold, salt, ivory, and slaves would become the lifeblood of the Mali Empire, contributing significantly to its wealth and power. Sundiata's leadership and reforms laid the groundwork for Mali's future prosperity, ensuring that the empire would thrive for generations. Following the death of Sundiata Keita in approximately the year 1255, the Mali Empire was left in a relatively stable state, with a strong foundation built upon his leadership, military victories, and political reforms. However, while Sundiata had laid the groundwork for a unified and powerful empire, the real task of consolidating and expanding that empire fell to his successors. The period from Sundiata's death to around the year 1300 marked a critical phase in Mali's history, as the empire worked to solidify its control over newly conquered territories, manage its growing wealth, and build an enduring political system that could withstand both internal and external pressures. After Sundiata's death, the Mali Empire was inherited by his son, Mansa, who ruled from 1255 to 1270. While Wali's reign was not as eventful or dramatic as his father's, it marked the first transition of power in the fledgling empire, and the peaceful succession was a key factor in the stability of the empire during this early period. Mansa is often described as a leader who focused on maintaining the peace Sundiata had won, rather than embarking on military campaigns or territorial expansion. Under his reign, Mali continued to grow as a political and cultural entity, but the real consolidation of Mali's power occurred during the rule of his successor, Mansa, who began his reign around 1270. Mansa's reign marked a significant shift in the trajectory of the empire. Whereas Wali had focused on maintaining order and peace, Mansa turned his attention to reinforcing Mali's territorial control and further centralizing its power. He launched several military campaigns to secure and expand the empire's borders. This was particularly important because, even though Sundiata had defeated Sumanguru and established the empire, many of the regions incorporated into Mali were still somewhat autonomous and lacked full loyalty to the central government. One of Sadi's key campaigns was aimed at subjugating the Manding peoples who had remained outside of Mali's control. The Manding had long been rivals of the Malinka people, and their resistance to Mali's rule was a potential threat to the stability of the empire. Through a series of campaigns, Mansa was able to bring these regions under his control, significantly expanding the empire's territory. By the time of Mansa's death, around the year 1290, Mali had solidified its position as the dominant power in the region. The empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the west to the Niger River in the east, and from the southern Sahel to the northern part of the Great Savannah. This vast territory encompassed a wide array of peoples, cultures, and resources, and the challenge for Mali's rulers moving forward would be maintaining control over such a large and diverse region. One of the key ways the empire was able to do so was through the development of a well-organized and highly efficient system of governance. The administration of Mali was decentralized in some ways but highly controlled in others. Mansa, like his predecessors, divided the empire into provinces, each ruled by a governor. These governors were usually chosen from among the royal family or other trusted elites, ensuring that the provinces remained loyal to the central government. This decentralized structure allowed for local autonomy, but the governors were always subject to the authority of the Mansa, the king of the empire. In this way, the Mali Empire was able to maintain control over its vast territories while also allowing for some degree of local governance. This balance of central authority and provincial autonomy would prove to be crucial for Mali's long-term stability. Mali's political structure also allowed for the effective management of the empire's economy. At the heart of the empire's economic system was the control of the trans-Saharan trade routes. Mali's position along these routes allowed it to become a central hub for trade in gold, salt, and other valuable commodities. Gold, in particular, was Mali's most important resource, and it was the wealth generated from this trade that allowed the empire to flourish. The Mansa controlled the gold mines of the region, and the empire became one of the largest producers of gold in the world. This wealth not only allowed Mali to maintain a powerful military, but also enabled it to build impressive infrastructure, including roads, bridges, and cities. One of the most important cities in the empire was Timbuktu, which, under the rule of Mansa, began to grow into a major center of commerce, culture, and learning. While Timbuktu had existed as a trading post for centuries, it was during the reign of Sadi that the city began to develop into a true urban center, with bustling markets, universities, and libraries. The wealth generated from trade allowed Mali to support scholars and intellectuals from all over the Muslim world, turning Timbuktu into one of the most renowned centers of learning in the medieval world. This reputation would only grow in the coming centuries, with Timbuktu becoming synonymous with Islamic scholarship and intellectual achievement. Another key aspect of Mansa Sadi's rule was his support for Islam. While Sundiata had initially been a tolerant ruler, encouraging peaceful coexistence between Muslim and traditional African belief systems, Sadi's reign marked the beginning of a more formalized role for Islam in Mali's political and cultural life. Mansa Sadi himself was a devout Muslim, and he used his position to promote the spread of Islam throughout the empire. He encouraged the construction of mosques and madrasas, Islamic schools, in the cities and towns of Mali, further cementing the religion's role in the empire. The support for Islam also helped to solidify Mali's ties with other Muslim powers in North Africa and the Middle East, further strengthening the empire's political and economic position. The reign of Mansa Musa, which lasted from approximately the year 1307 to 1337, is widely regarded as the pinnacle of the Mali Empire. His reign not only marked the height of Mali's territorial power and wealth, but it also transformed the empire into a global symbol of grandeur and influence. Mansa Musa's rule was characterized by extraordinary wealth, monumental construction projects, and significant cultural and intellectual achievements. However, it was his legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 that cemented his place in history and made the Mali Empire famous far beyond the borders of West Africa. Mansa Musa's rise to the throne was not without its challenges. He was not originally the first in line to inherit the throne. According to historical accounts, Musa was initially appointed as a deputy to his predecessor, Mansa Abubakari II, who famously embarked on an ill-fated expedition across the Atlantic Ocean in search of the ends of the earth. Mansa Abubakari's journey, which ultimately ended in his disappearance, left the throne vacant and opened the path for Musa to ascend to power. It is worth noting that the story of Mansa Abubakari's voyage is shrouded in mystery, and there are various interpretations of the details surrounding the event. But it is believed to have had significant implications for the future of the Mali Empire. Once Musa assumed the throne, he quickly consolidated his power and began the task of governing an empire that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Niger River. His leadership style was characterized by both military prowess and diplomatic skill. Under his reign, the Mali Empire expanded significantly, absorbing new territories and strengthening its control over key trade routes. The empire's wealth, already considerable, grew even further as Mansa Musa capitalized on Mali's strategic position in the trans-Saharan trade network. Gold, salt, ivory, and slaves continued to flow through the empire, reinforcing its status as one of the wealthiest states in the medieval world. Perhaps the most defining feature of Mansa Musa's reign was his extraordinary wealth. It is said that he was so rich that the sheer scale of his wealth defied imagination. His control over the gold mines of the region, particularly in the areas around Bambouk, Touré, and Ouagadougou, gave him access to an abundance of gold, which he used to fund numerous public works projects, including the construction of mosques, palaces, and schools. In fact, it is said that Mansa Musa's wealth was so vast that it caused inflation in the markets he visited during his famous pilgrimage to Mecca. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 remains one of the most famous events in the history of the Mali Empire. The pilgrimage, or Hajj, was an important religious journey for any devout Muslim. But for Mansa Musa, it was also an opportunity to display his empire's wealth and prestige to the wider world. Accompanied by a massive entourage, some reports suggest it numbered in the tens of thousands, Musa made his way across the Sahara and into North Africa, traveling through cities such as Tagaza and Cairo. His caravan included soldiers, attendants, traders, and even camels carrying vast amounts of gold. When Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo, he made an impact that would be felt for centuries. The sheer opulence of his entourage, laden with gold and precious goods, was overwhelming. According to accounts from the time, Musa's generosity was unparalleled. He distributed vast amounts of gold to the people he encountered, including scholars, officials, and the poor. His lavish spending in Cairo was so extravagant that it reportedly caused a temporary devaluation of gold in the city. This display of wealth not only made Mansa Musa famous, but also earned him the respect and admiration of the broader Islamic world. In addition to his generosity, Mansa Musa's pilgrimage also had profound effects on the wider Islamic world. During his journey, Musa made contacts with various Islamic leaders and scholars, which helped to strengthen the Mali Empire's ties to the broader Muslim world. He also used the opportunity to bring back scholars, architects, and intellectuals to Mali, further enriching the empire's cultural and religious life. This cultural exchange contributed to the development of Mali as a center of learning and Islamic scholarship. Timbuktu, in particular, began to flourish as a center of intellectual and cultural exchange during Mansa Musa's reign. While the city had long been a hub for trade, it was under Musa's patronage that it truly became renowned for its scholarship and religious significance. Musa commissioned the construction of the Jingureber Mosque, one of the most important religious buildings in West Africa, and he established the University of Timbuktu, attracting scholars and students from across the Muslim world. The city became a focal point for Islamic learning, with many notable scholars and theologians residing there. The reputation of Timbuktu as a center of knowledge would only grow in the following centuries as the city became synonymous with intellectual achievement. Mansa Musa's support for Islamic culture and scholarship extended beyond Timbuktu. He also sponsored the construction of mosques and schools in other parts of the empire, including Gao, the administrative center of the eastern part of Mali. His efforts to promote Islam within the empire helped to solidify its place as a key part of Mali's cultural and political identity. The spread of Islam, however, was not just about religious conversion. It also played a critical role in the development of a shared cultural and intellectual framework that unified the diverse peoples of the empire. While Mansa Musa's reign is often remembered for its cultural and religious achievements, it is important not to overlook his military and administrative skills. The wealth and prosperity of the Mali Empire were not solely the result of Mansa Musa's generosity. They were also the product of his effective governance and military prowess. Musa maintained a large and well-trained army which helped to defend the empire's vast borders and suppress rebellions from within. His military campaigns ensured that the empire remained stable and secure during his reign. In terms of administration, Mansa Musa continued the work of his predecessors by maintaining a decentralized system of governance, with local governors overseeing the empire's provinces. These governors were responsible for maintaining law and order, collecting taxes, and ensuring the smooth functioning of the empire. However, the Mansa retained ultimate authority, and his central position allowed him to make key decisions on matters of national importance. Mansa Musa's death in approximately the year 1337 marked the end of an extraordinary era for the Mali Empire. Under his rule, the empire reached its zenith in terms of wealth, territorial extent, and cultural influence. However, the stability of the empire, built on such remarkable achievements, began to falter in the years that followed. The decline of the Mali Empire in the wake of Mansa Musa's death was not the result of a single cause, but rather the outcome of a combination of internal instability, external pressures, and the difficulties inherent in governing a vast and diverse empire. Mansa Musa's immediate successors faced significant challenges that would prove difficult to overcome. Although the empire's territorial borders remained extensive, the central authority weakened. The decentralized system of governance that had served Mali well in its early years began to strain under the empire's growing size and complexity. This decentralization had initially allowed for local autonomy, but by the time of Mansa Musa's death, it had created a fragmented system in which provincial governors held considerable power. While these governors were loyal to the Mansa during Musa's reign, the loyalty of regional leaders became less certain after his death. The weakening of central authority contributed to the fragmentation of the empire into semi-autonomous regions, each with its own local interests. One of the key problems facing the Mali Empire during this period was the issue of succession. The Mansa's power had been largely personal, and the role of the ruler was so closely tied to the figure of Mansa Musa that his death left a vacuum of leadership. After Mansa Musa's passing, the empire saw a series of short reigns by various rulers, some of whom struggled to maintain control over the vast territories of Mali. These rulers, including Mansa Magan, Mansa Suleiman, and others, were often not as powerful or charismatic as Musa, and they lacked his ability to command the loyalty of the empire's diverse peoples. While these leaders were able to maintain the empire for a time, their reigns were marked by political infighting, lack of cohesion, and a failure to address the growing internal challenges that Mali faced. The failure to effectively manage succession contributed to the weakening of Mali's central government. A lack of strong leadership, combined with the decentralization of power, created a fragmented political landscape in which rival factions competed for control. This instability made it difficult for the empire to address the numerous challenges it faced, including external threats, internal revolts, and economic difficulties. Another significant factor in the decline of the Mali Empire was the empire's economic difficulties. Although the Mali Empire had once been one of the wealthiest states in the world, largely due to its control over the gold trade, the empire's economic foundation began to erode in the decades following Mansa Musa's death. The decline of the gold trade, exacerbated by the shifting patterns of trade across the Sahara, placed significant strain on the empire's finances. Additionally, the rise of competing states, such as the Songhai Empire to the east, began to undermine Mali's control over key trade routes and resources. The Songhai Empire, which had long been a rival of Mali, began to assert its dominance in the region during this period. By the early 15th century, Songhai had emerged as a powerful empire in its own right, and its leaders began to challenge Mali's influence over the trans-Saharan trade routes. The rise of Songhai was particularly problematic for Mali, as it disrupted the flow of goods and resources through Mali's territories, weakening the empire's economic position. One of the most significant external challenges that Mali faced during this period was the increasing pressure from the growing power of the Songhai Empire. Songhai, initially a vassal state of Mali, had begun to break away from Mali's control in the 13th century, and by the early 15th century, it had developed into a powerful and independent empire. Under the leadership of Askia Muhammad, who took power in the late 15th century, Songhai would go on to challenge Mali for dominance over West Africa. The rise of Songhai further complicated Mali's attempts to maintain control over its territories, and the empire found itself embroiled in military conflicts that further weakened its authority. In addition to the Songhai threat, Mali also faced pressure from other external forces. In the early 14th century, the Mali Empire had maintained diplomatic and trade relations with the Kingdom of Morocco, and the two powers had cooperated in various ways. However, by the end of the 14th century, Morocco, under the leadership of the Wattasid dynasty, began to interfere more directly in Mali's affairs. The Moroccan forces launched military campaigns into Mali's territory, further destabilizing the empire and contributing to its decline. Internally, Mali also faced significant challenges. The empire had long been home to a diverse range of peoples, with various ethnic groups and languages. While the empire had been able to maintain unity under the strong leadership of Mansa Musa, the absence of a charismatic ruler led to internal divisions. Regional leaders began to assert their own power, often at the expense of the empire's cohesion. The Malinka, the ethnic group that had formed the core of the empire, began to fracture into competing factions, and the unity that had characterized the early years of the empire began to disintegrate. The rise of regionalism also led to frequent rebellions and revolts, Provinces that had once been firmly under the control of the central government began to seek greater autonomy, and in some cases, they broke away from the empire entirely. The most notable of these was the city of Timbuktu, which had long been a vital cultural and economic center for Mali. In the late 14th and early 15th centuries, however, Timbuktu began to assert its independence, and the loss of this important city further diminished Mali's power. Another critical factor in the empire's decline was the weakening of the Mali military. While the Mali Empire had once been a formidable military power, capable of defending its borders and maintaining order within its territories, the empire's military strength declined after Mansa Musa's death. The growing internal strife, combined with the external threats from Songhai and Morocco, drained Mali's military resources. Furthermore, the decentralized nature of the empire made it difficult to coordinate a unified defense against these external threats. As a result, the empire was unable to mount an effective response to the challenges it faced. The decline of Mali's military power also had economic consequences. With the military spread thin and unable to defend key trade routes and cities, Mali's control over its economic resources weakened. The loss of territories to rival states such as Songhai resulted in a reduction in the wealth generated by trade, particularly in gold, salt, and slaves. The empire's economic troubles were compounded by inflation and a decline in agricultural productivity, as the empire's vast territories were increasingly difficult to manage. As the Mali Empire entered a period of internal decline in the 15th century, the balance of power in West Africa began to shift dramatically. One of the most significant factors in the decline of Mali was the rising strength of the Songhai Empire, which had been a vassal state under Mali's control for much of the previous century. The rise of Songhai, coupled with the weakening of Mali's central authority, would eventually lead to a dramatic change in the political landscape of West Africa. The Songhai Empire's origins can be traced back to the early medieval period, but it was during the 14th and 15th centuries that it began to emerge as a major regional power. Located along the Niger River, Songhai had long been an important player in the trans-Saharan trade networks. However, it was under the leadership of a series of strong rulers that Songhai began to challenge Mali's dominance in the region. The Songhai people, like the Malinka who had established the Mali Empire, were part of a larger network of ethnic groups and cultures that had lived along the Niger River for centuries. While Songhai had long been a powerful kingdom in its own right, it had been overshadowed by the Mali Empire, which controlled the key trade routes and territories of the Western Sahel. The Malinka, under the leadership of their powerful rulers, had exerted control over Songhai, forcing them to pay tribute and abide by Mali's political and military dominance. However, as the Mali Empire began to weaken in the early 15th century, the Songhai Empire seized the opportunity to assert its independence. The first major turning point in the Songhai-Mali relationship occurred during the reign of Mansa Suleiman of Mali, who ruled from approximately 1400 to 1430. While Mansa Suleiman attempted to stabilize the empire and maintain control over its territories, his reign was marked by growing internal divisions, external threats, and a lack of strong leadership. During this time, the Songhai people, led by their ruler, Sani Ali, began to challenge Mali's control over the region. Sani Ali, who ruled Songhai from approximately 1470 to 1492, is considered one of the most important figures in the early history of the Songhai Empire. A military genius, Sani Ali expanded the Songhai Empire dramatically during his reign, conquering key cities that had previously been under Mali's control, including Timbuktu and Djenné. The capture of Timbuktu in 1483 was particularly significant, as it had long been a center of trade, culture, and Islamic scholarship within the Mali Empire. Sani Ali's military campaigns against Mali were not only focused on territorial conquest, but also on undermining the political and economic structures that had supported the Mali Empire. By capturing the major cities of the Sahel, Sani Ali effectively cut off Mali's access to vital trade routes and resources, including the gold and salt that had fueled the empire's economy. The loss of these key cities was a blow to Mali's power as it struggled to maintain control over its vast and increasingly fragmented territory. At the same time, Sani Ali sought to undermine the authority of Mali's rulers by challenging their legitimacy. The Songhai ruler made it clear that he did not see himself as subordinate to Mali's Mansa, but rather as a ruler in his own right. The capture of Timbuktu and other important cities marked the beginning of Songhai's rise to prominence, and it signaled the weakening of Mali's power in the region. Despite these challenges, Mali was not entirely powerless in the face of Songhai's rise. The Mali Empire still controlled significant territory, particularly in the west, and it had a powerful military that could still pose a threat to Songhai. However, the internal fragmentation of the Mali Empire, coupled with the growing influence of Songhai, meant that the empire was increasingly unable to respond effectively to external challenges. After Sani Ali's death in 1492, the Songhai Empire experienced a brief period of instability. His son, Sani Baru, ascended to the throne but was unable to maintain the same level of control and power. The political situation in Songhai became complicated by the rise of Islamic factions within the empire, which sought to replace the traditional animist rule of Sani Ali with a more orthodox Islamic leadership. This factionalism created internal divisions within Songhai, and the once dominant empire was threatened by a series of coups and rebellions. It was during this period of uncertainty that Askia Muhammad, a military leader and statesman, seized power. Askia Muhammad, also known as Askia the Great, would go on to transform the Songhai Empire into one of the largest and most powerful states in West Africa. He took power in 1493 after a military coup that deposed Sani Baru. Askia Muhammad's reign would mark the beginning of Songhai's golden age and its transformation into a dominant power in the region. One of Askia Muhammad's first acts as ruler was to consolidate power within the Songhai Empire. He reformed the administration of the empire, centralizing authority and establishing a strong bureaucratic system. Askia Muhammad also sought to solidify Songhai's military position by strengthening its army and establishing alliances with neighboring states. His military campaigns further expanded Songhai's territory, and he is credited with extending the empire's control over much of the western Sahel. Under Askia Muhammad's leadership, Songhai grew even more powerful and influential. The empire's control over key trade routes allowed it to dominate the trans-Saharan trade, particularly in gold, salt, and slaves. This wealth was used to fund military campaigns, build infrastructure, and support the arts and sciences. The Songhai Empire also became a major center of Islamic scholarship, particularly in the city of Timbuktu, which had been captured from Mali by Sani Ali. Timbuktu became a focal point for Islamic learning, attracting scholars from across the Muslim world. The rise of the Songhai Empire under the leadership of Askia Muhammad in the late 15th and early 16th centuries represented the peak of West African power and influence. At its height, Songhai controlled a vast territory stretching from the Atlantic coast to the borders of modern-day Niger and Nigeria, encompassing rich trade routes and thriving cities like Timbuktu and Gao. However, like the Mali Empire before it, Songhai's prosperity was not to last forever. The empire's decline came swiftly, triggered by both internal instability and external threats, and by the mid-16th century, Songhai was a shadow of its former self. One of the key reasons for the fall of the Songhai Empire was the weakening of central authority. Askia Muhammad, who had done much to stabilize the empire and consolidate power, was eventually overthrown in a coup. In 1515, his son, Askia Musa, deposed him, and the power struggles that followed left the empire vulnerable to internal conflicts. After Askia Muhammad's removal, the empire suffered from a series of weak or contested rulers who struggled to maintain control. The lack of a strong, unified leadership destabilized Songhai, and the once cohesive empire began to fragment into competing factions. This fragmentation further weakened the military, economy, and social cohesion of the empire, making it difficult to fend off external challenges. While the internal instability posed a serious threat, it was the external pressures that ultimately led to Songhai's downfall. The first significant external threat to the empire came from the north, from the Kingdom of Morocco. During the reign of Askia Muhammad's successors, Morocco, which had been a regional power in North Africa for centuries, saw an opportunity to expand its influence southward. In the late 1550s, the Moroccan Sultan, Ahmad al-Mansur, began to focus on extending his empire's reach into West Africa. One of the main motivations behind Morocco's interest in Songhai was its access to the vast gold mines in the region, particularly those in the Bambouk and Touré goldfields, which had been crucial to the Songhai economy. In 1581, the Moroccan Sultan launched a military campaign to conquer Songhai and gain control over these gold mines. The Moroccan forces, equipped with firearms and gunpowder, were vastly more advanced than the Songhai military, which relied largely on traditional weapons like spears and swords. The Moroccan army, led by the general Judar Pasha, defeated the Songhai forces decisively in the Battle of Tondibi in 1582. This crushing defeat marked the beginning of the end for the Songhai Empire. The Moroccans, armed with superior military technology, were able to march into the Songhai heartland, seizing key cities such as Gao, the empire's capital, and Timbuktu, a cultural and intellectual center that had long been a symbol of Songhai's power and wealth. The Moroccan conquest of Songhai, however, was not just about territorial expansion, it was also about economic control. By capturing the gold-producing regions of Songhai, Morocco effectively crippled the empire's economy, which had been built on the wealth generated by trade in gold and salt. The loss of control over these vital resources dealt a blow to the Songhai economy from which it could never recover. The economy, already weakened by internal strife and factionalism, collapsed in the wake of the Moroccan invasion. In the wake of the Moroccan invasion, Songhai struggled to maintain any semblance of central authority. The military defeat and the loss of key cities fractured the empire further, and various regions of Songhai fell into the hands of local rulers. The once mighty empire splintered into smaller competing states, many of which were either too weak or too divided to challenge Morocco's dominance. While the Moroccans were able to control Songhai for a time, they were never able to fully stabilize the region. The Moroccan presence in West Africa would eventually fade, and the area would remain divided for centuries. The collapse of the Songhai Empire also had profound cultural and intellectual consequences. Songhai, like its predecessor the Mali Empire, had been a major center of learning and Islamic scholarship. The city of Timbuktu, in particular, had been a renowned hub of Islamic education, attracting scholars, theologians, and students from all over the Muslim world. Under the Songhai Empire, Timbuktu was home to several large and influential universities and libraries that housed priceless manuscripts on subjects ranging from astronomy to law. The fall of Songhai, however, marked the end of Timbuktu's golden age as a center of learning. The cultural impact of the collapse of the Songhai Empire extended beyond education. The empire's failure to protect its cultural and religious institutions led to the erosion of the shared identity that had once bound the diverse peoples of the empire together. Islam, which had flourished under the Songhai rulers, began to recede as the region entered a period of political fragmentation. The loss of Songhai as a cohesive empire and the shifting of power dynamics in the region also led to a gradual decline in the cultural exchanges that had once linked the various West African empires to the broader Muslim world. The effects of the decline of Songhai also resonated in the surrounding regions. The collapse of the Songhai Empire created a power vacuum in West Africa, which would eventually be filled by a new set of states and empires. These new powers, including the Kingdom of Kanem-Bornu and the Fulani Empire, would continue to shape the political landscape of West Africa in the centuries to come. However, none of these new empires would attain the same level of influence, wealth, or territorial control that Songhai had once held. In the immediate aftermath of the Moroccan invasion and the fall of Songhai, the region descended into further disarray. Local rulers and warlords controlled fragmented territories, and the once vibrant cities of Timbuktu and Gao fell into decline. While some of these cities would eventually be rebuilt, they would never regain their former status as centers of power, trade, or culture. Songhai's collapse also marked the end of West Africa's golden age of empires, as the once great kingdoms of Mali and Songhai were replaced by smaller, less influential states. However, the legacy of the Songhai Empire persisted long after its decline. The empire's cultural contributions, particularly in the fields of education, trade, and Islamic scholarship, continued to influence West Africa for centuries. The intellectual traditions that had flourished in Timbuktu and other Songhai cities lived on in the minds of scholars, historians, and artists who preserved the empire's rich history in their works. Even in the face of political and military defeat, the Songhai Empire's intellectual and cultural achievements remained an important part of West Africa's heritage. The colonial era in West Africa marked a dramatic transformation in the region's political, economic, and social landscape. The rise and fall of the Mali Empire, along with the decline of Songhai, left an indelible mark on the history of the Sahel, but it was during the 19th century that Mali and the entire region entered a new phase under European colonial rule. The imposition of foreign control would disrupt traditional political structures, redefine the region's economy, and reshape the social fabric of its people. By the end of the 19th century, Mali was firmly under French control as part of French West Africa. However, the empire's legacy continued to influence the way the region developed during and after colonialism. In the early 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade was at its peak, and the European powers had a growing interest in expanding their influence across Africa. The establishment of European colonies in Africa was primarily driven by the desire to control resources, establish new trade routes, and exploit the continent's human and material wealth. The economies of European countries, particularly those involved in industrialization, were heavily reliant on raw materials and labor from colonies in Africa. West Africa, with its rich resources of gold, ivory, and other valuable goods, had long been a key target of European trade. The competition for control of African territories escalated throughout the 19th century. The French, British, and other European powers gradually expanded their influence, carving up the African continent through treaties, military conquest, and diplomatic negotiations. This period saw the end of the African empires that had dominated the region for centuries and the beginning of a new era in which colonial powers sought to redefine the political boundaries of Africa. The French first became involved in the region in the early part of the 19th century, particularly in the wake of the decline of the Songhai Empire. French explorers, traders, and missionaries ventured into the interior of West Africa, seeking to expand France's commercial interests in the region. The French colonial enterprise in West Africa was part of a broader push to secure control over vital resources and expand France's influence across Africa. The French began their conquest of Mali in the second half of the 19th century as part of their broader campaign to control all of French West Africa. French forces gradually moved into the Sahel, defeating local kingdoms and resistance forces, and establishing military garrisons along key trade routes. In the region that was once the heart of the Mali Empire, the French encountered local resistance but also exploited existing divisions between different ethnic groups. This made it easier for the French to establish their control, though they faced periodic uprisings and revolts against their presence. One of the critical moments in the French conquest of Mali was the military expedition led by France's Lieutenant Colonel Louis Archinard in the 1890s. Archinard's forces marched into the interior, engaging in battles against local resistance groups, including the forces of the Bambara Kingdom. The Bambara people, who had been one of the dominant ethnic groups in the region after the fall of the Mali Empire, put up fierce resistance to French encroachment. However, after a series of battles and the eventual capture of key Bambara cities, the French were able to secure control over the region by the late 1890s. In the wake of their conquest of Mali, the French consolidated their rule in the region, and in 1899, they officially created the Federation of French West Africa. This federation included several French colonies, including Senegal, Ivory Coast, and modern-day Mali, all governed under a centralized colonial administration. The creation of French West Africa was a significant step in the consolidation of French power in West Africa, and Mali became an integral part of this colonial entity. The French administration imposed new political boundaries on the region, dividing it into smaller administrative districts. The colonial state sought to control every aspect of life in the colony, from local governance to the economy. This was a period of heavy exploitation as France sought to extract resources from the land while maintaining tight control over trade routes and labor. The new colonial boundaries, many of which ignored the historical divisions between different ethnic groups, sowed the seeds for future ethnic tensions and conflicts. The French also introduced a system of forced labor which disrupted traditional agricultural practices. They relied heavily on the labor of the local population to work on French plantations and in the extraction of raw materials such as gold, cotton, and rubber. This exploitation of labor had long-lasting effects on the social and economic fabric of the region, undermining traditional systems of land ownership and forcing many Malians into servitude. The French colonial presence in Mali and other parts of West Africa had a profound effect on the region's economy. Before the colonial period, the Mali Empire had been a hub for trade, particularly in gold, salt, and other precious commodities. However, under French rule, the economy was reshaped to meet the needs of the colonial powers. The French established a system of cash crop agriculture, encouraging the cultivation of crops such as cotton, groundnuts, and millet. These crops were grown primarily for export to France, and local farmers were often forced to grow them instead of their traditional crops, such as rice and sorghum. The French also built infrastructure to facilitate the extraction of resources and improve communication and transportation. They constructed railroads and roads to connect the interior of Mali to the coast, enabling the French to move goods and soldiers more efficiently. The development of this infrastructure, while benefiting the colonial economy, came at a high cost to the local population, which was often forced into labor to construct roads and railways. The social changes brought by colonialism were equally transformative. The French imposed a new system of education, which was heavily focused on teaching the French language and values. This led to a decline in traditional African education systems and the loss of knowledge and customs passed down through generations. While a small elite was educated in French schools, the majority of the population had limited access to formal education, further entrenching the inequalities of colonial rule. The imposition of French culture and language also had significant consequences for local traditions and religious practices. While Islam had been a dominant force in the region for centuries, especially after the rise of the Mali Empire, the French sought to impose their own brand of secularism and Christianity. Missionaries worked to convert the local population to Christianity, and many schools and churches were established across Mali. These efforts, while not entirely successful in converting the masses, played a key role in eroding traditional belief systems and weakening the power of Islamic institutions. Despite the French presence and the harsh conditions of colonial rule, there were several instances of resistance throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many Malians, inspired by the memory of their former empires, resisted the encroachment of the French in various ways. One of the most notable examples of resistance was the Bambara resistance led by the figure of Touré. Touré, who had established a powerful kingdom in the region, led a series of successful military campaigns against French forces in the late 19th century. His resistance efforts were ultimately unsuccessful, as the French eventually defeated his forces in the 1890s, but his actions inspired future generations of Malians to resist colonial rule. Another significant moment of resistance occurred in the early 20th century, when the French imposed heavy taxes on the local population and further entrenched their control over the economy. In response, several local leaders and communities organized protests and uprisings. While these uprisings were often crushed by French forces, they contributed to the growing sentiment of resistance that would eventually lead to Mali's struggle for independence. By the mid-20th century, the winds of change were blowing across Africa. Following World War II, the French Empire began to weaken, and colonial powers around the world faced mounting pressure for independence. In West Africa, nationalist movements began to gain momentum, and Mali, like many other African nations, began to demand its freedom. The rise of independence movements was fueled by the desire for self-rule, economic autonomy, and the end of colonial exploitation. The mid-20th century marked a period of profound change across Africa, as colonial empires began to weaken and nationalist movements surged in response to the growing demand for self-determination. In French West Africa, including the territory that would later become the modern state of Mali, the call for independence was gaining momentum. The road to independence was long and fraught with challenges, but by 1960, Mali would become one of the first African countries to achieve independence from European colonial powers. This section explores the social, political, and cultural forces that led to the rise of modern Mali. It delves into the key events and figures that shaped Mali's nationalist movement and examines the complex legacy of the French colonial era. While the country's independence was a monumental achievement, the journey was shaped by both internal and external factors, including the legacy of the Mali Empire and the challenges of transitioning from colonial rule to self-governance. Mali's journey to independence was deeply influenced by the legacy of French colonial rule. The French had ruled the region for nearly a century, and during that time, they imposed a centralized system of governance that stripped much of the region's traditional power structures. The French colonial economy was heavily exploitative, relying on forced labor, cash crops, and resource extraction, which left little room for local development. Socially, the French sought to undermine indigenous cultures and belief systems, replacing them with French language, education, and Christianity. However, the colonial era also left behind a complex set of legacies that would shape Mali's future. Although the French imposed their rule through violence and exploitation, they also introduced modern infrastructure, such as roads, railways, and communication systems, which became critical assets for the new nation after independence. Additionally, the French education system, though limited in scope and access, created a small but influential class of educated Africans who would go on to play key roles in the independence movement. The independence movement in Mali, as in much of West Africa, was shaped by both local political dynamics and the broader wave of decolonization sweeping across the continent. The French government's post-World War II reforms, which promised greater self-governance to the African colonies, played a crucial role in galvanizing the push for independence. These reforms led to the creation of political parties and the formation of local assemblies, where educated African elites began to voice their dissatisfaction with French colonial rule. One of the central figures in Mali's nationalist movement was Modibo Keïta, a charismatic leader who would later become the first president of independent Mali. Keïta's political career began in the French Colonial Assembly, where he advocated for greater rights and representation for African people. He was deeply influenced by socialist ideals, which resonated with the desire for economic independence and social justice that was widespread in the African independence movements of the time. Keïta's political ideology, heavily influenced by Marxist and Pan-African ideas, emphasized the importance of unity among African nations and the need for a socialist economic model that prioritized local development and the welfare of ordinary people. This vision of unity and self-determination resonated with many Malians who were disillusioned with the economic exploitation they had endured under French rule. Keïta's rhetoric and policies aimed at modernizing Mali's economy, improving education, and advancing healthcare, all while maintaining Mali's cultural and religious traditions, played a significant role in shaping the nation's identity after independence. As the momentum for independence grew, the political landscape of French West Africa began to shift. By the late 1950s, several West African colonies, including Senegal and Mali, had formed a political union known as the Mali Federation. This federation was intended to be a stepping stone toward independence, and it united various groups under a common cause: the removal of French colonial rule. The Mali Federation, formed in 1959, was a short-lived political entity that lasted only a few months. Senegal and Mali both played key roles in its formation, and the federation was initially seen as a powerful symbol of African unity. However, despite the shared goals of independence, tensions quickly emerged between the two territories. The political dynamics between Senegal's president, Léopold Senghor, and Mali's leaders, including Modibo Keïta, led to disagreements over the distribution of power and resources within the federation. Senegal, under Senghor, favored a more gradual and pragmatic approach to independence, while Keïta and his supporters in Mali were committed to a more radical break from colonial structures. These differences led to the dissolution of the Mali Federation in August of 1960. While the federation lasted only briefly, it was a significant milestone in the broader independence movement, as it represented the growing desire for self-rule and the beginning of a more unified effort to challenge French colonial dominance. After the collapse of the Mali Federation, Mali and Senegal pursued their independence separately. For Mali, the road to full independence came in September of 1960, when it officially became a republic within the French community. However, this status was merely a temporary arrangement, and Mali's leaders continued to push for full independence from France. The final break from France came on September 22, 1960, when Mali declared its full independence. The country's first leader, Modibo Keïta, assumed office as president, and Mali entered a new era as an independent nation. The country's newfound independence was celebrated as a moment of triumph and pride for the Malian people, but it also marked the beginning of the difficult task of nation-building. The challenge of establishing a viable, self-sustaining state was immense. Mali, like many newly independent African nations, faced a range of challenges, including political instability, economic underdevelopment, and the need to create a unified national identity in the face of regional and ethnic diversity. Despite the considerable obstacles, Keïta's vision for a socialist republic, where wealth would be redistributed, agriculture would be modernized, and education and healthcare would be prioritized, resonated with many Malians. His government embarked on a series of reforms, including the nationalization of key industries and the expansion of infrastructure. However, Keïta's policies, particularly his move toward a one-party system and his ambitious social and economic programs, began to face resistance. The challenges of creating a socialist economy in a country still recovering from the devastation of colonial rule were formidable. Keïta's centralized approach to governance also alienated many regional leaders, who felt that they had been marginalized in the new government. Keïta's government faced significant challenges in its first years. The promises of socialism and self-reliance were difficult to realize in the context of an underdeveloped economy. The country lacked the infrastructure and industrial base necessary for large-scale economic reforms, and efforts to collectivize agriculture met with limited success. The Malian economy, heavily dependent on agriculture, was struggling to keep up with the demands of a growing population. Keïta's government also faced challenges in managing Mali's diverse ethnic and regional groups. The unity that had been forged during the fight for independence began to fracture as regional disparities and ethnic tensions resurfaced. The centralization of power in Bamako, the capital, contributed to the alienation of people in the more remote regions of the country, particularly in the north and east. Keïta's attempts to build a united socialist republic were complicated by the difficulties of balancing ethnic, regional, and political interests. The early years of Mali's independence were marked by ambitious social and economic reforms under President Modibo Keïta's leadership. However, as the 1960s progressed, the country's political landscape began to shift, and it became clear that the promises of independence and socialism would not be easy to fulfill. By the mid-1960s, Modibo Keïta's government faced mounting challenges, including economic difficulties, political unrest, and growing dissatisfaction with his centralized control. The struggles of nation-building proved to be more difficult than many had anticipated, and these tensions ultimately led to political instability, culminating in a military coup in 1968. When Mali declared its independence in 1960, President Keïta's government was determined to build a socialist republic. Drawing inspiration from socialist models and the principles of economic self-sufficiency, Keïta and his allies sought to transform Mali's economy. Their vision was one in which Malians would be freed from the legacies of colonial exploitation, and the country's vast agricultural potential would be harnessed for the benefit of all its people. However, the reality of achieving this socialist vision proved to be far more complicated. The country's agricultural base, upon which its economy relied, struggled to meet the demands of modernization. Mali's rural population, which made up the majority of the country's workforce, was not easily transitioned into the collective farming system that the socialist policies called for. Many farmers resisted the idea of collectivization, fearing the loss of their land and livelihoods, and this resistance slowed the pace of economic reforms. Additionally, the lack of infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, made it difficult for farmers to access the resources they needed, such as tools, fertilizers, and transportation. The Malian government also struggled to diversify its economy beyond agriculture. The industrial sector was underdeveloped, and the country lacked the capital and technical expertise needed to build a modern industrial base. Keïta's government attempted to nationalize key industries, including mining and textiles, but the transition was uneven and riddled with inefficiencies. Foreign investments in Mali dwindled, partly due to the political instability of the region and partly because of the country's socialist economic policies, which created a disincentive for private enterprise. As the economy stagnated, living conditions for ordinary Malians worsened. Rural poverty remained widespread, and urban areas began to experience growing discontent. The government struggled to address issues such as food shortages, inflation, and high unemployment. Despite the government's efforts, Mali's economic difficulties deepened, and by the late 1960s, dissatisfaction with Keïta's leadership was growing among both urban intellectuals and the rural population. The economic decline was accompanied by political unrest. Modibo Keïta's government, which had initially been hailed as a symbol of hope and unity, began to show signs of authoritarianism. As the pressures of governance mounted, Keïta increasingly relied on a one-party system with the Democratic Union of the Malian People, UDPM, at its core. While this approach was intended to ensure political stability and unity, it had the opposite effect, alienating opposition groups and stifling political dissent. Keïta's centralization of power also created friction within the ruling elite. Many within the government, including military officers, felt excluded from decision-making processes, and this bred resentment. The country's intellectual and political class, once supportive of the socialist agenda, began to express doubts about the government's ability to deliver on its promises. Public protests and strikes in urban areas became more frequent, and even the once supportive trade unions began to challenge the administration. The discontent with Keïta's leadership reached a boiling point in the mid-1960s as the economic situation continued to deteriorate. The government's inability to address food shortages, rising prices, and the growing gap between urban elites and rural populations led to widespread frustration. By 1968, Keïta's government, once considered a beacon of hope for African socialism, had become increasingly isolated and unpopular. The tipping point for Modibo Keïta's regime came on the night of November 19, 1968. A group of military officers, disillusioned with the inefficiencies and centralization of Keïta's government, staged a coup d'état, overthrowing the president and his administration. The coup was led by Lieutenant Colonel Musa Traoré, a military officer with a background in the armed forces who had grown increasingly frustrated with the lack of political power afforded to the military. The coup was swift and largely bloodless, reflecting the degree to which Keïta's authority had eroded by the late 1960s. The military's intervention was presented as a necessary step to restore order and address the country's political and economic problems. Musa Traoré and his fellow officers justified their actions by arguing that Keïta's policies had failed and that Mali needed new leadership to move forward. Traoré's military regime promised to restore order, reduce corruption, and revitalize the economy. Initially, the coup was met with some public support, as many Malians were eager for a change from the economic hardships and political instability that had characterized Keïta's rule. The military government suspended the constitution, dissolved the UDPM, and imposed a state of emergency, giving the military full control over the country. However, the military's promises of reform quickly faltered as the new regime faced many of the same challenges that had plagued Keïta's government. While Traoré and his allies sought to stabilize the economy, they found themselves unable to address the structural problems that had long hindered development. The military's control over the economy created inefficiencies, and its heavy-handed approach to governance alienated many sectors of society. Musa Traoré's government initially enjoyed some degree of legitimacy, as many Malians saw the coup as a necessary step to break free from Keïta's failed socialist experiment. Traoré himself presented the coup as an opportunity for reform and national renewal. He promised to create a more inclusive political system, allow for the return of political freedoms, and revitalize the economy through a combination of state intervention and modernization. However, over time, Traoré's regime became increasingly authoritarian. One of the early actions of Traoré's government was to crack down on opposition groups and political dissidents. While the military had initially promised to allow for greater political participation, it soon became clear that Traoré was consolidating power in the hands of the military elite. Political parties were banned, and opposition leaders were either imprisoned or exiled. The promise of a return to civilian rule was gradually abandoned, and the country was governed by the military through a series of decrees. Traoré's regime also imposed harsh economic policies that were not well received by the population. His government continued to rely heavily on state control of the economy, but the lack of genuine economic reforms led to stagnation. The same issues of corruption, inefficiency, and economic inequality that had plagued Keïta's government persisted under Traoré, and the population became disillusioned with his leadership. Throughout the 1970s, Mali's economy remained stagnant. The country was heavily dependent on the export of gold, cotton, and other raw materials, but the international market conditions were unfavorable. The state-controlled economy struggled to generate the growth that the population needed, and the gap between the elite and the masses continued to widen. By the mid-1970s, the country was facing food shortages and rising inflation, leading to a decline in living standards for many Malians. The military regime's failure to address the economic crisis, combined with its increasingly repressive political tactics, set the stage for a new wave of protests and uprisings. In the late 1970s, the tensions between the government and the population began to escalate as demands for political freedoms and economic reforms grew louder. The seeds of the next phase of Mali's political history were being sown as the frustrations of the population boiled over into widespread protests and dissatisfaction with military rule. The early 1990s marked a pivotal period in the history of modern Mali. After over 2 decades of military rule under Musa Traoré, Mali's political landscape was ready for change. The country's economy remained stagnated and social unrest continued to grow, fueled by a combination of economic hardship, political repression, and widespread dissatisfaction with the ruling military regime. The demand for democratic reform became impossible to ignore. As a result, Mali underwent a dramatic transition from a military dictatorship to a civilian government, laying the foundation for the democratic era that would follow. The regime of Musa Traoré, which began with a military coup in 1968, lasted for more than 2 decades. During this time, the country endured a combination of authoritarian rule, economic decline, and social unrest. Despite the initial promises of reform, the military government became increasingly repressive and ineffective. By the 1980s, Mali's political and economic situation had deteriorated significantly. The country was grappling with severe economic challenges, including food shortages, inflation, and rising debt. There was a growing sense of frustration within the population, particularly among the urban youth, intellectuals, and labor unions, who saw the regime as incapable of addressing the nation's problems. The economic stagnation and political repression created the perfect storm for widespread protests and demands for change. Throughout the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, various sectors of society began to call for democratic reforms. Opposition groups, which had been silenced for years under military rule, began to re-emerge, organizing protests, strikes, and demonstrations. The labor unions, student groups, and civil society organizations were at the forefront of these movements. These efforts culminated in a series of large-scale protests in March of 1991, as Malians took to the streets to demand the resignation of Traoré and the establishment of a democratic government. The protests were met with violent repression by the military government, but the tide of public sentiment had shifted. The military, weakened by internal divisions and the pressure of mounting protests, was no longer able to maintain control. On March 26, 1991, after several days of intense protests and violence, Musa Traoré was overthrown in a coup led by Captain Amadou Toumani Touré and a group of disgruntled soldiers. Traoré was captured and later tried, marking the official end of his military dictatorship. Touré and the coup leaders established a transitional government and promised that the country would move towards civilian rule and democracy. The military junta quickly dismantled the one-party system that had been imposed under Traoré's regime and began preparations for national elections. This was a significant moment in Mali's political history, as the country was now poised to transition from military rule to a civilian-led democracy. In the aftermath of the coup, Mali embarked on a process of national dialogue and reconciliation. A national conference was convened in July of 1991, with the goal of laying the groundwork for a new constitution and democratic elections. The conference brought together representatives from a broad spectrum of society, including political parties, labor unions, civil society groups, and regional representatives. The conference's outcome was a consensus on the need for a multi-party system, greater political freedoms, and respect for human rights. One of the key outcomes of the National Conference was the drafting of a new constitution. The constitution, which was adopted in January of 1992, enshrined democratic principles and established the framework for Mali's future governance. It set up a presidential system of government where the president would be elected by popular vote, and it guaranteed fundamental freedoms such as the right to free speech, assembly, and press. The new constitution also introduced term limits for the presidency, marking a significant departure from the previous authoritarian rule. With the new constitution in place, the country moved toward its first democratic elections. In April of 1992, Mali held its first free and fair presidential elections in decades. The elections were contested by several political parties, marking the beginning of Mali's multi-party system. The elections were closely watched by both domestic and international observers, as they represented a critical test of Mali's commitment to democracy. In the second round of the presidential election, Alpha Oumar Konaré, a former historian and member of the opposition, emerged as the winner. Konaré had played an active role in the anti-Traoré movement and was seen as a reformist figure capable of leading the country through its transition to democracy. His victory was widely hailed as a triumph for the people of Mali, and his election marked the beginning of a new chapter in the country's political history. Alpha Oumar Konaré's presidency, which began in 1992, was characterized by a strong commitment to building democratic institutions and improving the country's economic and social development. As the first democratically elected president of Mali, Konaré faced the enormous task of consolidating democratic gains while addressing the country's pressing economic and social issues. His government focused on several key areas, including strengthening democratic institutions, promoting human rights, and improving Mali's standing in the international community. Konaré's government began by implementing political and economic reforms aimed at modernizing the country and improving its prospects for growth. The new government pursued a policy of economic liberalization, opening up the market to foreign investment and encouraging private sector growth. Konaré also sought to improve Mali's relations with international financial institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to secure much-needed foreign aid and investment. However, despite these efforts, Mali's economic challenges remained significant. The country continued to rely heavily on agriculture, particularly cotton and livestock, and it struggled with issues such as food insecurity, unemployment, and poverty. The implementation of structural adjustment programs, which were designed to open the economy and reduce the role of the state, faced resistance from various sectors of society, including labor unions and rural farmers. Although Mali made progress in some areas, such as improving infrastructure and expanding access to education, the overall economic situation remained challenging. Konaré's government also worked to strengthen Mali's democratic institutions, with an emphasis on decentralization and local governance. In the early years of his presidency, the government introduced reforms aimed at giving more power to regional and local governments. This was seen as a way to address regional disparities and ensure that political power was more evenly distributed across the country. Konaré's government also worked to improve transparency and reduce corruption, although these efforts faced significant challenges. Mali's political system during Konaré's presidency was far from perfect. While the country enjoyed greater political freedoms, opposition parties often criticized the government for its control over the media and its dominance in the political process. In the elections of 1997 and 2002, Konaré was re-elected, but his victories were marred by allegations of electoral fraud and a lack of political competition. Despite these criticisms, Mali remained one of the few democratic successes in West Africa, and Konaré's leadership was widely regarded as a stabilizing force. After Konaré's two-term presidency ended in 2002, the baton was passed to Amadou Toumani Touré, a former military officer who had played a key role in the 1991 coup that overthrew Musa Traoré. Touré's presidency, which began in 2002, was initially marked by optimism. He was seen as a reformist figure who could continue the work of building a stable and democratic Mali. However, the challenges of governing in the 21st century proved difficult for Touré. Mali, like many other countries in the region, faced growing concerns about security, particularly in the northern regions, which had been long neglected by the central government. The rise of armed groups in the Sahel, combined with regional instability, posed serious challenges for Mali's security forces. As Mali entered the 21st century, it faced a complex mix of political instability, economic challenges, and mounting security threats. The peaceful transition to democracy that began in the early 1990s was increasingly tested by internal divisions, regional instability, and the growing presence of extremist groups in the Sahel. While the country's democratic institutions initially flourished, the military coup of 2012 marked a sharp turn in Mali's political trajectory. Since then, the nation has struggled with balancing democratic governance, national unity, and countering the persistent threat of insurgencies in the north. The story of modern Mali is one of resilience in the face of adversity. The country's journey through the turbulence of the 21st century continues to unfold, and the political, social, and security challenges it faces today are far from simple. This section explores the critical events and factors that have shaped Mali since the coup of 2012, focusing on the political crisis, international interventions, and the ongoing battle to reclaim stability and security in the region. In March of 2012, Mali's political landscape was upended by a military coup that overthrew the democratically elected president, Amadou Toumani Touré. Touré had come to power in 2002 after a peaceful transition from military rule, and his tenure was generally seen as successful in terms of establishing democratic governance and stabilizing the country. However, as his second term came to an end, dissatisfaction with his handling of the growing security threats in northern Mali, particularly from Islamist and separatist groups, led to widespread protests and discontent within the military. Mali's northern regions, which had long been marginalized by the central government in Bamako, became increasingly unstable in the early years of the 21st century. The Tuareg rebels, an ethnic group from northern Mali, had a long history of demands for greater autonomy, if not outright independence. In early 2012, a new Tuareg rebellion broke out, exacerbated by the collapse of the Libyan regime under Muammar Gaddafi. The fall of Gaddafi had a destabilizing effect on the Sahel as many former Libyan fighters returned to their home countries, bringing with them weapons and military experience. The Tuareg rebellion, which initially aimed for greater autonomy for the northern regions, was quickly co-opted by extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, Ansar Dine, and other jihadist factions. These groups pushed further into Mali, capturing key cities such as Timbuktu, Gao, and Kidal, as well as large swaths of territory across northern Mali. The Malian military, already stretched thin and underprepared to deal with the insurgency, was quickly overwhelmed. The military coup, which was led by Captain Amadou Sanogo and a group of disillusioned soldiers, was partially a response to the perceived incompetence of President Touré in handling the escalating crisis in the north. The coup was initially supported by large portions of the Malian population, who were frustrated with the government's inability to address the growing insurgency. Sanogo and his colleagues promised to restore order and defend the integrity of the country. But the immediate result of the coup was the destabilization of the government and the disbanding of the military leadership. The coup plunged the country into a political vacuum. With no clear leadership in Bamako, the rebels and extremist groups seized the opportunity to solidify their control in northern Mali. By the middle of 2012, northern Mali was under the control of various armed groups with conflicting goals. Ansar Dine, led by Iyad Ag-Ghali, and AQIM took control of the cities in the north, implementing harsh versions of Sharia law and destroying cultural heritage sites in cities like Timbuktu. The international community, deeply concerned by the rapid spread of Islamist extremism in Mali and the potential for further destabilization across the region, responded swiftly. In January of 2013, the French military launched Operation Serval, a military intervention aimed at halting the advances of the jihadist groups in northern Mali. France, Mali's former colonial power, took the lead in the operation, supported by African troops from the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and other international partners. The intervention was successful in pushing back the Islamist forces from key cities such as Gao, Timbuktu, and Kidal. The French forces, along with the Malian army and regional troops, were able to reclaim large portions of northern Mali. However, the intervention did not eliminate the root causes of the conflict, and the insurgency continued in various forms. The jihadists, although pushed out of urban centers, moved into the vast desert and mountainous regions of the north, where they could regroup and launch new attacks. The French intervention, although successful in regaining control of territory, highlighted the fragility of the Malian state. The conflict also underscored the need for a more comprehensive political solution. In the aftermath of the military intervention, the United Nations established the United Nations Multidimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, MINUSMA, in April of 2013. MINUSMA's mandate was to assist in the stabilization of the country, protect civilians, support the peace process, and ensure the delivery of humanitarian aid. While MINUSMA has been instrumental in providing security and assistance, the situation in northern Mali remains precarious, and the presence of armed extremist groups continues to pose a threat to both Mali and its neighbors. Following the recapture of major cities in northern Mali, the country's transitional government began to focus on negotiating a peace deal with the Tuareg rebels and other armed groups in the region. The peace process was difficult, as the rebel groups had disparate aims. While the Tuareg groups generally sought greater autonomy for the northern regions, the Islamist groups had more radical goals, seeking the establishment of an Islamic state in Mali. In June of 2015, the Malian government and several rebel factions signed the Algiers peace agreement, brokered by the United Nations, Algeria, and other international partners. The agreement included provisions for decentralization, autonomy for the northern regions, and the reintegration of former combatants into the national army. The peace deal was hailed as an important step toward resolving the conflict, but it was not without challenges. While the government and some rebel factions agreed to the terms of the peace deal, not all groups were satisfied. Various factions, including some hardline Tuareg and Islamist groups, refused to sign or adhere to the agreement. Furthermore, implementing the terms of the peace agreement has proven to be an ongoing challenge. Security in northern Mali remains fragile, with sporadic clashes between rebel groups and government forces, as well as attacks by jihadist militants who continue to undermine stability. The presence of armed groups in northern Mali continues to be a significant challenge to the implementation of the peace agreement. The lack of trust between the Malian government and rebel groups, as well as the ongoing influence of jihadist groups, means that peace remains elusive. The government's authority in the north is still limited, and many regions remain under the control of local militias or other armed factions. As Mali moved through the early years of the 21st century, the country faced increasingly complex security challenges. The extremist groups that had taken over northern Mali in 2012 had been pushed back by the French-led intervention, but they did not disappear. Instead, they adapted, resorting to guerrilla warfare and attacks on civilians, military personnel, and international peacekeepers. The Sahel region, of which Mali is a central part, has seen the rise of jihadist groups with links to global terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. These groups have exploited the vast, often ungoverned spaces in the desert regions, and they frequently target both the Malian military and peacekeepers from MINUSMA. The threat of terrorism continues to grow, as extremist organizations have found fertile ground in the instability of the region. Mali's security forces, despite the training and support provided by international partners, remain overstretched and underfunded, making it difficult for the government to fully regain control of the north and ensure the safety of its citizens. The government has also struggled to address the underlying causes of the conflict. The political marginalization of northern Mali's ethnic groups, particularly the Tuareg, has remained a point of contention. The peace process, while significant, has not fully healed the divisions between the different regions and groups. The ongoing violence and instability have hindered efforts to rebuild the country and strengthen its democratic institutions. The journey toward stability in Mali has been fraught with challenges, particularly in the context of regional insecurity and the growing threat of terrorism. Despite significant progress in certain areas, including a transition to democracy and the international community's efforts to assist Mali, the country remains deeply entrenched in struggles against extremist groups. Since the crisis in 2012 and the French-led intervention, Mali's security situation has remained precarious. Jihadist organizations, as well as ethnic militias, continue to destabilize large swaths of the country, particularly in the northern and central regions. This section examines the continuing fight against terrorism and the wider regional instability that Mali faces today. It also explores the involvement of international actors, the challenges faced by the Malian government, and the complex political and social dynamics that hinder peace and security in the Sahel. Ultimately, the story of Mali's struggle with terrorism is tied to broader regional issues, making it a critical issue for both Mali and its neighbors in the Sahel. The roots of Mali's current security crisis lie in the wider regional context of instability in the Sahel. Mali shares borders with several countries, including Algeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania, all of which are affected by growing jihadist insurgencies. The vast and often ungoverned territories of the Sahel, combined with weak national governments, porous borders, and economic underdevelopment, have created a fertile ground for the rise of jihadist groups. While Mali has long faced challenges related to separatist movements in the north, particularly by the Tuareg rebels, the growing influence of global jihadist movements in the region has added an entirely new and dangerous dimension to the conflict. The expansion of jihadist groups such as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, and the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS, in the mid-2000s significantly altered the security landscape in Mali and the Sahel. These groups, initially operating on the fringes of the conflict in northern Mali, have grown in power and influence, forging alliances with local militants and other extremist factions. Their presence has destabilized not only Mali but also neighboring countries, triggering a security crisis across the entire region. AQIM, which has its origins in Algeria, began to spread southward across the Sahel during the early 2000s. The organization has linked up with local militant groups, including some from Mali, to exploit the region's vulnerabilities. The jihadists quickly gained control of large territories in northern Mali during the chaos of the 2012 rebellion, when the Tuareg separatists were initially joined by Islamic extremist forces. After the French-led intervention in 2013, which successfully expelled AQIM and its allies from key urban areas, these groups retreated to the desert and mountainous regions, where they regrouped and launched a persistent campaign of attacks. The rise of the Islamic State in the region added another layer of complexity. The Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS, emerged as a rival to AQIM, particularly in the Western Sahel. The group's reach extended into Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, complicating the fight against jihadism and further fragmenting the already unstable region. Both AQIM and ISGS engage in a range of activities, from direct military assaults on government forces and civilians to kidnappings, extortion, and the disruption of essential services. These jihadist groups have used violence and intimidation to recruit fighters and control territory, targeting both the state's military forces and civilians. They have also exacerbated ethnic tensions, particularly in central Mali, where local militias, including Fulani and Dogon groups, have become embroiled in violent clashes. The jihadist agenda has fueled the cycle of violence in the region, drawing in ethnic groups and local militias, which complicates efforts to establish peace. Mali's military and government forces, despite being bolstered by international support, have been struggling to regain control of key regions in the north and center. While the French intervention and the United Nations MINUSMA mission have contributed to stabilizing urban areas, the central and northern regions remain highly insecure. The presence of jihadist groups and their attacks on military and civilian targets continues to challenge the effectiveness of the Malian government. In addition to the ongoing military threats, these groups have also targeted the Malian government's infrastructure and governance structures. The road to peace in Mali has been further complicated by the fact that the country's political authority is often limited outside of the capital, Bamako, and a few other urban centers. The central government's lack of presence in rural areas has made it difficult for the state to assert its control, creating a power vacuum that is often filled by armed groups, whether jihadist factions or local militias. Moreover, the presence of extremist groups has led to widespread displacement, particularly in the northern and central parts of Mali. Thousands of civilians have been forced to flee their homes due to the violence, adding a humanitarian dimension to the ongoing crisis. Refugee camps and displaced persons have become a common sight, with families fleeing not only the jihadist threat but also the inter-ethnic violence and lack of basic services. The Malian military, despite receiving training and resources from international partners, remains overstretched. Corruption, lack of resources, and insufficient equipment continue to undermine the effectiveness of the Malian army, making it difficult for them to confront the complex and evolving nature of the insurgencies. The army's inability to restore order in the north has deepened the divide between the capital and the country's rural areas, further eroding the state's legitimacy in the eyes of many Malians. Given the magnitude of the security threat in the Sahel, the international community has been heavily involved in Mali's efforts to combat terrorism. The French intervention, Operation Serval, successfully retook key cities in the north, but it did not end the jihadist insurgency, and France continued its involvement with Operation Barkhane. This mission, launched in 2014, has focused on counter-terrorism operations throughout the Sahel, extending beyond Mali to include countries like Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad. In addition to French forces, the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Mali, MINUSMA, remains a crucial component of Mali's security strategy. MINUSMA, established in 2013, has worked to provide stability in the country's conflict zones, protect civilians, and support the peace process. Despite its significant presence and the backing of various international actors, MINUSMA has faced numerous challenges, including frequent attacks on peacekeepers and difficulty navigating the complex local dynamics. Regional cooperation through the G5 Sahel force has also been important in addressing cross-border terrorism. The G5 Sahel is a joint military initiative between Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Niger. The force has been tasked with combating terrorism, smuggling, and organized crime throughout the region. However, the G5 Sahel has faced its own set of challenges, including limited funding, coordination issues, and the lack of effective cooperation between member states. Despite these obstacles, the G5 Sahel remains a critical component of regional efforts to stabilize the Sahel. In addition to these efforts, the United States and European Union have provided training, financial aid, and logistical support to Malian and regional forces. However, the overall coordination between various international stakeholders remains difficult, and the persistent insecurity in the region shows that these external interventions alone are not enough to solve the underlying political, social, and economic problems. The security situation in Mali has resulted in an ongoing humanitarian crisis, with thousands of people displaced by violence, insufficient access to basic services, and widespread poverty. The central government's limited ability to respond to the needs of the population, particularly in the conflict-affected areas, has left many Malians dependent on international aid. The humanitarian situation has become more urgent as the conflict has dragged on, and the continued insecurity makes it difficult for aid organizations to operate effectively in some regions. The peace process, which began with the Algiers Peace Agreement in 2015, remains an ongoing process with mixed results. While some of the agreement's provisions have been implemented, such as the reintegration of former combatants into the national army and the establishment of regional administrative autonomy, progress has been slow. The presence of jihadist groups in northern Mali has complicated the implementation of the peace agreement, and a lack of trust between the Malian government and rebel groups continues to hinder the peace process. Despite the challenges, there have been efforts toward reconciliation, particularly with the Tuareg rebel factions in the north. However, the inclusion of jihadist groups in peace negotiations remains contentious, as many of these groups have no intention of negotiating a lasting peace and instead continue to pursue their radical agenda through violence and intimidation. The overall situation remains volatile, with both the government and rebel factions vying for control over the regions. Mali's path forward will require sustained efforts on multiple fronts. While international assistance has been crucial in providing security and humanitarian support, the underlying causes of the conflict, such as ethnic divisions, political marginalization, and poverty, must be addressed for long-term peace to take root. National reconciliation, political reforms, and a commitment to inclusive governance will be essential for rebuilding trust in the central government and ensuring that all Malians, especially those in marginalized regions, feel represented and protected. As Mali continues its struggle with political instability, ongoing security challenges, and internal divisions, the country's economic recovery has become a crucial priority. The economic fallout from the 2012 coup, the subsequent conflict, and the disruptions caused by jihadist insurgencies have had lasting effects on the Malian economy. Despite these challenges, the nation's economic resilience and the efforts of both the government and international partners to rebuild have shown some promising results. However, the path to sustained economic growth remains uncertain, particularly in a region beset by political fragility, ethnic tensions, and terrorism. This section will explore Mali's economic challenges and recovery efforts, focusing on the key sectors driving the country's growth, the obstacles impeding progress, and the role of international aid and investment in supporting Mali's development. The economic difficulties Mali faces are intertwined with its security and political issues, making comprehensive economic recovery a complex and multifaceted undertaking. The 2012 military coup and the subsequent insurgency had an immediate and profound effect on Mali's economy. The conflict disrupted trade, agriculture, and essential services, leading to a sharp economic decline. Cities in the north, including Gao, Timbuktu, and Kidal, were occupied by jihadist groups, and key infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and government buildings was destroyed or abandoned. This instability compounded the existing issues of poverty and underdevelopment that had plagued Mali for decades. One of the most immediate economic impacts was the displacement of thousands of people. As conflict and insecurity spread, millions of Malians were forced to flee their homes, either to other parts of the country or across international borders. Displacement disrupted agricultural production, further limiting Mali's ability to generate revenue through its traditional economic sectors. Refugees and internally displaced persons were dependent on humanitarian aid, which created a significant strain on resources, both for the government and for international aid organizations working in the region. Tourism, which had been an important source of revenue, especially in cities like Timbuktu, was severely impacted by the insurgency. Mali, known for its rich history, Islamic heritage, and ancient cities, saw a sharp decline in international visitors, as potential tourists were discouraged by the instability. The collapse of the tourism sector, combined with the overall decline in foreign investment, further stalled economic growth and development. Additionally, the Malian government's ability to generate revenue through taxes and trade was severely limited by the insecurity. Northern Mali, a major trading region, became increasingly difficult to access, affecting both local markets and international trade routes. As much of the country's productive capacity ground to a halt, government revenues plummeted, further exacerbating Mali's fiscal deficit. In the years following the French-led military intervention and the signing of the Algiers peace agreement, Mali began its efforts at recovery. Despite ongoing security challenges, the Malian government, along with international partners, sought to stabilize the economy and rebuild key sectors. Several steps were taken to address the immediate economic needs of the population and lay the groundwork for future growth. Agriculture is the backbone of Mali's economy, employing over 60% of the population and contributing a substantial portion to the nation's GDP. Mali has a favorable climate for farming, with the Niger River providing an essential irrigation system. The country is a major producer of cotton, which remains one of its most important exports, as well as a wide range of food crops, such as rice, millet, and maize. However, the agriculture sector has faced numerous challenges in recent years. The conflict and insecurity in the north have severely disrupted farming activities, and the lack of infrastructure, such as roads and storage facilities, has hindered agricultural development. Additionally, Mali has been increasingly affected by climate change, with unpredictable rainfall patterns and rising temperatures negatively impacting crop yields and water resources. The Malian government, along with international aid organizations, has focused on rebuilding the agriculture sector through initiatives aimed at improving irrigation systems, enhancing agricultural practices, and increasing access to markets. The goal has been to boost food production and reduce dependence on imports. Despite these efforts, significant obstacles remain, including the lack of rural credit, the absence of modern farming equipment, and the challenge of reconciling environmental concerns with economic needs. Mali is rich in natural resources, with significant deposits of gold, which has long been the country's most valuable export. In recent years, Mali has become one of Africa's largest gold producers, and the mining sector plays a crucial role in the country's economy. Gold mining provides jobs, contributes to government revenues through taxes and royalties, and attracts foreign investment. In addition to gold, Mali is also believed to have potential in other minerals, including bauxite, iron ore, and limestone. However, mining in Mali is not without its challenges. The sector is often criticized for its lack of regulation, poor environmental practices, and the failure to adequately benefit local communities. The growth of the mining industry has also exacerbated existing socioeconomic inequalities, as much of the wealth generated by mining is concentrated in the hands of foreign investors and a small elite, while many Malians remain impoverished. Despite these challenges, the mining sector holds promise for Mali's economic future. Efforts have been made to improve governance in the sector, including the establishment of the Mali Mining Code, which aims to regulate exploration and ensure greater transparency. International investors, particularly in the mining and energy sectors, continue to show interest in Mali's resource-rich areas, and foreign direct investment remains a key driver of growth. However, the instability caused by jihadist groups and ethnic militias continues to disrupt mining activities, particularly in northern Mali, where some of the country's largest gold deposits are located. Mines have been attacked, and gold shipments have been intercepted by armed groups. Despite these threats, Mali's mining sector has remained relatively resilient, continuing to attract investment, albeit at a slower pace than would be expected in a more stable environment. Given the scale of the challenges facing Mali, international aid has played a significant role in the country's recovery. Donor countries, multilateral institutions, and international organizations, including the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, have provided crucial financial support for the Malian government's economic stabilization efforts. Aid has been directed towards infrastructure development, healthcare, education, and poverty reduction programs. The international community has also supported the Malian military and peacekeeping efforts to combat terrorism and maintain stability in the country. Despite the substantial assistance from international partners, many critics argue that aid alone cannot solve the country's underlying issues. Mali's development challenges are deeply rooted in its political and social structures, and unless these issues are addressed, long-term economic recovery will be difficult. The Malian government has sought to diversify its sources of funding beyond international aid, encouraging private investment in agriculture, mining, and infrastructure projects. However, the unstable security situation remains a major deterrent for foreign investors, making it difficult for the government to attract the level of investment needed for sustained growth. While significant progress has been made in addressing the immediate aftermath of the conflict, the path to long-term economic recovery remains fraught with obstacles. Mali's economy continues to be heavily dependent on a few key sectors, agriculture and mining, leaving it vulnerable to external shocks. Global price fluctuations for commodities like gold and cotton have a direct impact on the country's economy, and the climate change-driven decline in agricultural productivity threatens food security and economic stability. One of the most pressing challenges for Mali is the need for structural reforms that address the country's deep-rooted inequalities. The economic divide between the urban elite, who often benefit from government policies and foreign investment, and the rural poor, who struggle with inadequate infrastructure and limited access to resources, remains stark. Addressing these disparities is crucial for building a more inclusive economy and ensuring that the benefits of growth are distributed more evenly across society. Another critical issue is the centralization of political and economic power in Bamako, the capital. While decentralization efforts have been made, the central government remains highly focused on urban areas, leaving rural and conflict-affected regions marginalized. This exclusion has exacerbated regional tensions and contributed to the ongoing instability in the north and center of the country. Strengthening regional governments, improving local governance, and ensuring equitable development across Mali's diverse regions are essential steps toward building a more stable and sustainable economy. Mali faces numerous challenges in its journey toward economic recovery, but there are also opportunities for transformation. The agriculture sector, with its potential for modernization, remains a key area of focus. Developing sustainable agricultural practices, improving access to credit for farmers, and expanding irrigation infrastructure could help boost productivity and reduce the country's reliance on imports. The mining sector, while not without its problems, has the potential to generate significant revenue for the country, provided that governance and environmental standards are improved. The growing interest in Mali's natural resources suggests that, with the right regulatory framework, the country could further expand its mining industry and ensure that more of the wealth generated benefits local communities. Mali's transition to democracy, which began in the early 1990s, remains one of the most significant political changes in the country's modern history. The efforts to establish a democratic system of governance have been met with both success and setbacks, as the country faces multiple challenges in terms of governance, security, and national unity. Despite the challenges posed by repeated coups, ongoing conflict, and an unstable security environment, Mali's democratic journey has also been marked by resilience, the gradual strengthening of political institutions, and an evolving political landscape. This section will delve into the political developments in Mali since 2016, analyzing the evolution of its democratic institutions, the setbacks faced, and the prospects for the future. By focusing on the period following the 2012 military coup, this section will examine the obstacles Mali has encountered in its quest for a stable democratic system and how the country's leaders and citizens continue to navigate the complex challenges of governance in the context of a deeply fractured political and social environment. After the military coup of 2012, Mali's political system was in disarray. The years that followed saw a transition back to civilian rule, which was marked by political, social, and economic instability. In the aftermath of the coup, Mali's new leadership faced the task of rebuilding democratic institutions, while simultaneously dealing with the growing presence of jihadist groups and other armed factions in the northern and central regions. This fragile context required a delicate balance between governance, peace-building, and reconciliation. The government that emerged after the coup was an interim one, with both political and military leaders involved in the transitional process. A National Transitional Council, CNT, was established, and a new constitution was drafted, which laid the foundation for future elections. However, the political system was not without its challenges. The fragility of Mali's political institutions was highlighted by the country's dependence on foreign support, primarily from France and other international partners, which was necessary to stabilize the country during this critical period. In the years that followed, Mali worked to rebuild democratic institutions, and in 2013, the country held its first democratic elections after the coup. These elections marked a crucial step forward in Mali's transition back to civilian rule, with the election of Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta as president. Keïta's victory was seen as a triumph for Mali's democracy, as it was a peaceful transition of power, and his government's initial focus was on national reconciliation and addressing the ongoing security challenges. Keïta's government, however, would face its own set of difficulties. Although the country managed to hold elections and restore some semblance of normalcy, the persistent insecurity in the north and the failure to fully implement the Algiers peace agreement led to continued instability. The peace process, which had been brokered between the Malian government and the Touré rebels, faltered due to a lack of trust between the parties and the interference of jihadist elements. Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta's presidency, which began in 2013, was initially seen as a hopeful chapter for Mali's post-coup recovery. Keïta, a former prime minister and experienced politician, promised to tackle Mali's most pressing issues: security, economic development, and political reform. His government worked to re-establish authority over the north and signed key agreements with rebel groups, including the Algiers peace agreement in 2015, aimed at ending the insurgency in the north and achieving national reconciliation. Despite these early efforts, Keïta's presidency became increasingly characterized by challenges, both internal and external. One of the main difficulties during his time in office was the inability to fully implement the peace agreement. While the government worked to integrate former rebel fighters into the national army and establish greater autonomy for northern Mali, the continued presence of armed groups and the destabilizing effects of jihadist activity hampered these efforts. Although some progress was made in bringing peace to certain regions, the overall security situation remained volatile, and large portions of the north were still under the control of militias or jihadist groups. Additionally, Keïta's government struggled with accusations of corruption and mismanagement, particularly in regard to public funds and government contracts. Critics argued that Keïta's government had failed to create sufficient reforms to address Mali's pervasive issues of inequality, poverty, and underdevelopment. The economy remained fragile, and many Malians continued to feel excluded from the benefits of any political progress. Another key setback during Keïta's presidency was the growing frustration among various political groups, which saw the government as overly centralized and dismissive of local concerns. The promise of decentralization made in the peace agreements was slow to materialize, and many local communities felt left out of the national political dialogue. Political opponents accused Keïta of consolidating power within the capital, Bamako, further alienating those in more remote regions of the country. Despite these setbacks, Keïta was re-elected for a second term in 2018, albeit amid accusations of electoral fraud and irregularities. While the elections were generally considered peaceful, the results were contested by opposition groups who argued that Keïta's re-election was marked by unfair practices. The protests that followed led to a tense political environment, and calls for reform grew louder. The allegations of a rigged election compounded the frustrations of many Malians, leading to a perception that the country's political institutions were still weak and easily manipulated. By 2020, Mali's political system was again under severe strain. The government's failure to address the pressing issues of insecurity, corruption, and the lack of economic opportunities led to widespread discontent. Public protests, which had begun to build momentum in previous years, escalated in the summer of 2020. Opposition groups led by the M5-RFP coalition accused Keïta of failing to live up to his promises, and the protests called for his resignation. The political instability that had been simmering for years finally reached a boiling point. The protests were met with violent repression by security forces, but the opposition maintained its pressure, with protests escalating in cities like Bamako. The continued instability and the government's inability to respond effectively to the protests set the stage for another military coup. On August 18, 2020, a group of Malian soldiers led by Colonel Assimi Goïta overthrew President Keïta, just as the country appeared to be on the brink of full political collapse. This coup, while widely condemned by the international community, was also seen by many Malians as a necessary intervention to end the political deadlock and bring about real change. The military junta, known as the National Committee for the Salvation of the People, CNSP, promised to restore stability and organize new elections within a reasonable time frame. Colonel Goïta, who became the leader of the junta, took control of the country, and the military junta announced plans for a transition to civilian rule. In the aftermath of the coup, the international community, including the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, imposed sanctions on Mali and called for the return to civilian rule. Despite these pressures, the junta maintained its hold on power and began a process of dialogue with political parties and civil society organizations to agree on a new political framework. The coup also prompted a shift in Mali's foreign policy, with the junta signaling a pivot toward Russia and other non-Western allies, particularly after the French military announced its withdrawal from Mali. Following the coup of 2020, Mali entered a new period of political transition, with the military junta taking steps toward organizing elections and returning to civilian rule. In September of 2020, the junta appointed a transitional president, Ba Ndao, a former military officer, and a transitional prime minister, Mokhtar Ouane, who was tasked with overseeing the transition process. The junta's roadmap for transition outlined a timetable for elections within 18 months, signaling a return to civilian governance. However, the political transition has not been without challenges. There have been ongoing tensions between the military leadership and political parties, which have criticized the junta for failing to deliver on its promises of reform. Moreover, the security situation in Mali remains dire, with jihadist groups continuing to carry out attacks in the north and center of the country. These security issues complicate the transition process, as the government struggles to assert its authority over the entire country. In May of 2021, another coup occurred, further destabilizing the transition. President Enda and Prime Minister Ouane were removed from office by Colonel Keïta and other members of the military junta, raising concerns about the true intentions of the military leaders. The coup, once again, sparked condemnation from international partners, but it also demonstrated the military's growing control over the political process. Despite these setbacks, the international community, including ECOWAS and the United Nations, continues to push for a return to civilian rule. ECOWAS has insisted on a timeline for elections and a return to a constitutional order, but the junta has made it clear that it intends to retain control for the time being. The situation remains fluid, with the international community watching closely to see how the transition unfolds. As Mali's democratic journey continues to unfold, the country faces immense challenges, both politically and economically. The repeated cycles of military coups, political instability, and the ongoing security crisis in the north have undermined the faith of many Malians in their government. However, there are also opportunities for reform and reconciliation. The transition to civilian rule, though rocky, presents a chance for Mali to re-establish democratic institutions and rebuild trust with the population. The path forward for Mali will depend on several factors. First and foremost, the security situation must improve. The government must regain control over the northern and central regions of the country and prevent the spread of jihadist activity. This will require a concerted effort by both the Malian government and its international partners to address the root causes of instability and ensure that political progress is accompanied by greater security. Second, Mali must continue to focus on governance reform, strengthening democratic institutions, and ensuring that the political process is transparent and inclusive. This will involve addressing corruption, improving public services, and promoting greater political participation. Mali's future as a stable democracy hinges on its ability to overcome ethnic and regional divisions and create a government that is truly representative of its people. In the 21st century, Mali's security situation has evolved beyond its borders, and its role in regional stability and security has become a focal point of international attention. The ongoing conflict within Mali has not only impacted the country's internal governance, but also destabilized the broader Sahel region. Mali's geographical position, sharing borders with several countries that are affected by similar challenges such as Niger, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, and Algeria, has made it a key player in regional efforts to combat terrorism, organized crime, and political instability. Mali's role in regional security, particularly its involvement in counter-terrorism efforts and regional peacekeeping initiatives, has become central to discussions on Sahelian stability. As the epicenter of insecurity in the Sahel, Mali faces the dual challenge of maintaining internal stability while contributing to the broader regional security framework. This section explores the complexity of Mali's position in regional security, its involvement in peacekeeping efforts, its relationships with neighboring countries, and its role in international initiatives aimed at stabilizing the Sahel. The Sahel region, which stretches across the southern edge of the Sahara Desert, has become a hotspot for instability, terrorism, and armed conflict. Mali is at the heart of this region, and its struggles have been emblematic of the wider security challenges faced by neighboring countries. The presence of transnational jihadist groups, many with links to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, has exacerbated an already fragile security environment. Mali's experience with terrorism began in earnest during the 2012 crisis, when jihadist groups, including Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQIM, Ansar Dine, and later the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, ISGS, took control of northern Mali. While international interventions, notably the French-led Operation Serval, successfully dislodged these groups from urban centers, the jihadist threat did not vanish. Instead, these groups retreated to the vast desert and mountainous areas, where they have continued to launch attacks, recruit fighters, and exert influence. This persistent insecurity within Mali has had a ripple effect across the entire Sahel region. terrorist groups operating from Mali have carried out attacks in neighboring countries, including Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania. These cross-border threats have highlighted the need for a coordinated regional response to address the spread of extremism and instability. As such, Mali's security situation is intricately tied to the overall stability of the Sahel. Mali's role in regional security has been framed through a series of multinational initiatives aimed at addressing the challenges posed by terrorism, organized crime, and insurgent groups. Several regional organizations and cooperation frameworks have been established to tackle the security crisis in the Sahel, and Mali has played a central role in these efforts. One of the most important regional initiatives is the G5 Sahel, a group of 5 Sahelian countries, Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad, established in 2014. The G5 Sahel was created as a response to the growing security threats in the region, including jihadist activity, human trafficking, and the illicit drug trade. The force, which is composed of military personnel from all 5 member states, is tasked with conducting joint counter-terrorism operations, securing borders, and addressing the root causes of instability in the Sahel. Mali has been an active member of the G5 Sahel, contributing troops and resources to the joint force. The G5 Sahel force has been instrumental in conducting military operations in the region, particularly in Mali's northern and central areas, where extremist groups remain active. However, the G5 Sahel has faced numerous challenges, including limited funding, logistical difficulties, and a lack of coordination between member states. Despite these challenges, the G5 Sahel continues to be a crucial part of the regional response to instability in the Sahel. Another significant regional initiative is the United Nations Multi-Dimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, MINUSMA. Established in 2013, MINUSMA has been tasked with providing peacekeeping support in Mali, particularly in the north, and assisting with the implementation of the Algiers peace agreement. MINUSMA has played a key role in supporting the Malian government and international partners in their efforts to restore security and stabilize the country. However, MINUSMA's presence has been challenged by the continued threat from armed groups and terrorist factions, which have targeted peacekeepers and humanitarian workers. In addition to these efforts, Mali is a member of the African Union, AU, and has participated in the AU's peace and security initiatives, which aim to promote peace and stability across the continent. The African Standby Force, ASF, a regional security mechanism under the AU, is designed to respond quickly to conflicts and crises in Africa. Mali's involvement in the ASF reflects its commitment to regional peacekeeping and cooperation, although the country's internal security challenges often complicate its ability to fully engage in these initiatives. Mali's relations with its neighbors are crucial to the success of regional security initiatives. The country shares borders with several states that are similarly affected by terrorist activity and armed insurgencies. While these countries face their own security challenges, cooperation between Mali and its neighbors is essential for managing cross-border threats and preventing the further spread of extremism. One of Mali's most significant regional partnerships is with Niger, which shares a long border with Mali in the Sahel. Both countries have faced attacks from jihadist groups, particularly in their border areas, and have cooperated closely on counterterrorism efforts. The joint military operations between Mali and Niger have helped disrupt the activities of extremist groups operating in the region, though both nations continue to face security challenges. Mali's relationship with Mauritania is similarly important. Mauritania has long been an active participant in regional security efforts, and its military has conducted operations against extremist groups in both Mauritania and northern Mali. The two countries share intelligence, conduct joint border patrols, and collaborate on regional counterterrorism initiatives. Mauritania's involvement in the G5 Sahel and other regional security frameworks strengthens the overall regional response to terrorism. Burkina Faso, another neighbor, has also been affected by the spread of jihadist violence from Mali. The country has experienced significant instability in its northern regions, with extremist groups launching attacks on military and civilian targets. In response, Burkina Faso has worked closely with Mali and other regional partners to combat these threats. The security situation in Burkina Faso has underscored the importance of regional cooperation in addressing the shared challenges of terrorism and instability in the Sahel. Chad, one of Mali's key regional allies, has also been an important player in the Sahel's security landscape. The Chadian military has been active in supporting Mali's efforts to combat jihadist insurgents, both through its participation in the G5 Sahel and as part of French-led counterterrorism operations. Chad's military presence in the region has been crucial in providing security and stability, particularly in the tri-border area between Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, where armed groups often operate. France's involvement in Mali and the broader Sahel region has been a key factor in efforts to counter terrorism and insurgency in the area. Following the 2012 crisis, France launched Operation Serval, which successfully helped Mali push back jihadist groups from the north. However, the French military presence in Mali has remained significant, with France continuing its Operation Barkhane to combat terrorism in the Sahel. This mission, which was initiated in 2014, focuses on counter-terrorism operations in Mali and neighboring countries, and French forces have worked alongside the Malian military, the G5 Sahel forces, and MINUSMA to maintain security. While France's military presence has been instrumental in combating jihadist groups, it has also been a source of controversy. In recent years, the French presence in the region has been criticized, both by local populations and political leaders, who view France's involvement as an extension of its colonial influence. The military coup in Mali in 2020 led to a shift in the country's foreign policy, with the new junta signaling a desire to reduce France's military presence. The French government announced the gradual withdrawal of troops from Mali, which marked a significant change in the regional security dynamic. Despite this, France has indicated that it will continue to play a role in regional security through its partnerships with other Sahelian countries and its support for the G5 Sahel and other regional security initiatives. France's ongoing engagement in the Sahel will be critical in shaping the future security landscape, especially as Mali continues to navigate its own political transition. As Mali continues to face its security challenges, the path forward will require not only national solutions, but also a renewed commitment to regional cooperation. The presence of jihadist groups and the instability of neighboring states means that Mali's security is intrinsically linked to the security of the entire Sahel region. Efforts to combat terrorism, organized crime, and armed insurgency will require sustained cooperation between regional governments, international partners, and multilateral organizations. The G5 Sahel remains a critical framework for regional security, though it must address the challenges of coordination, funding, and effectiveness. The military junta in Mali, while initially viewed as a destabilizing force, has indicated a desire to continue cooperation with regional partners, albeit with a shift in priorities. Mali's relationship with France, while strained, is likely to remain an important element of the broader counterterrorism effort, and the withdrawal of French forces will necessitate a reassessment of how to maintain security in the region. Mali's future role in regional stability will depend on its ability to address the root causes of insecurity, including governance issues, corruption, ethnic tensions, and the lack of basic services in conflict-affected areas. Strengthening political institutions, promoting reconciliation, and investing in economic development will be essential for reducing the appeal of extremist ideologies and building long-term stability in the Sahel. In the midst of Mali's ongoing struggles with political instability, security challenges, and economic hardships, the role of civil society and the youth population has become increasingly critical. Throughout the country's modern history, civil society organizations, grassroots movements, and young people have played key roles in advocating for change, promoting democratic values, and pushing for national reconciliation. In the current context, as Mali faces its most significant crises since its independence, The involvement of civil society and youth is crucial for achieving long-term stability, fostering social cohesion, and ensuring a peaceful and prosperous future. This section will explore how civil society in Mali has evolved, particularly in the post-coup period, and how young Malians are shaping the future of their country. We will also analyze the challenges that civil society and youth face in Mali, the ways in which they are contributing to the country's democratic process, and how their engagement can provide hope for overcoming the country's entrenched issues of governance, security, and economic development. Mali's civil society has long been a powerful force for change, often stepping in to fill gaps left by a fragile state apparatus. The growth of civil society in Mali, particularly since the 1990s, has been an important development in the country's democratic evolution. Civil society groups have played a vital role in holding the government accountable, advocating for human rights, promoting gender equality, and pushing for political and social reforms. From grassroots organizations to larger NGOs and international partnerships, civil society in Mali has been integral to the fight for justice and transparency. During the 1990s, as Mali transitioned from authoritarian rule to a multi-party democracy, civil society organizations emerged as critical players in the political landscape. These organizations were essential in organizing protests, voicing opposition to military rule, and facilitating dialogue between the government and the people. The involvement of civil society in the democratic transition helped to solidify the importance of civic engagement, and its continued activism throughout the years has reinforced Mali's commitment to democracy. Since the 2012 coup, civil society has remained a crucial actor in the country's political and social recovery. Amid the political upheaval and instability, civil society organizations played an essential role in advocating for the restoration of constitutional order and a return to democratic governance. When the military junta took control of Mali after the coup, organizations such as the Malian Association for Human Rights, AMDH, the Malian Network for the Defense of Human Rights, RAPDH, and others worked to ensure that human rights were respected during the transition period and that the political process remained as inclusive as possible. In the years since the coup, civil society organizations in Mali have been involved in various efforts, including reconciliation initiatives, peace-building activities, and monitoring the implementation of peace agreements, such as the Algiers Peace Agreement signed in 2015. These organizations have worked to promote dialogue between different ethnic groups, advocate for the inclusion of marginalized communities in decision-making processes, and ensure that the voices of ordinary Malians are heard in national debates. Despite the importance of civil society, these organizations face several challenges. The political environment in Mali remains fragile, and civil society organizations often face resistance from both state and non-state actors. In the context of conflict, human rights organizations, particularly those focused on the actions of armed groups, are frequently targeted. Additionally, limited funding, government hostility, and threats of violence have hindered the effectiveness of some civil society groups. Despite these challenges, civil society remains a cornerstone of Mali's democratic fabric and continues to play a vital role in the country's long-term recovery. Mali's youth population, which makes up a significant portion of the country's total population, is an increasingly important demographic in the country's political and social future. With nearly half of Mali's population under the age of 25, young people represent a powerful force for change. Over the past decade, Mali's youth have been increasingly active in political movements, social advocacy, and efforts to address the country's security and economic challenges. The youth of Mali have experienced the country's democratic transition as well as its setbacks. Many of them grew up during a period of relative stability and prosperity, but have witnessed the decline in political and economic conditions, particularly after the 2012 coup and the subsequent crisis. As a result, youth in Mali have become increasingly frustrated with the status quo and have taken to the streets to demand political reform, better governance, and the end of corruption. In the lead-up to the 2020 protests, young Malians were at the forefront of the M5 RFP movement, a coalition of opposition groups calling for the resignation of President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta. This movement was driven in large part by the youth, who were dissatisfied with the failure of the government to address the country's pressing challenges, including the security crisis, the economic downturn, and widespread corruption. The M5RFP protests, led by opposition leaders, gained traction largely due to the activism of young Malians who were eager for change. Youth in Mali have also been active in the fight for gender equality, education reform, and environmental protection. In a country where youth unemployment is high and access to quality education is limited, many young Malians are advocating for more opportunities, particularly in the fields of education and employment. Young women, in particular, have been organizing around issues such as girls' education and women's rights, calling for greater access to resources and opportunities in a society where gender inequality is still pervasive. Additionally, young Malians have increasingly turned to digital platforms and social media to organize protests, share information, and advocate for political change. Social media has become a vital tool for youth movements in Mali, enabling young people to communicate more effectively, mobilize for social causes, and raise awareness about issues such as human rights abuses and political corruption. This shift to digital activism has allowed youth movements to gain a wider audience, both within Mali and internationally. Despite their growing influence, young people in Mali face significant challenges. Unemployment, poverty, and lack of access to education are among the most pressing issues for the youth population. The country has one of the highest youth unemployment rates in the world, with many young Malians struggling to find meaningful work. This situation is compounded by a lack of vocational training, limited opportunities in the formal economy, and a political system that often overlooks youth needs. The high rate of unemployment has led to widespread frustration among young Malians, many of whom are disillusioned with the lack of opportunities and the failures of the political system to deliver on promises of economic development. Youth unemployment has been a driving force behind political movements and protests, as young people demand that the government prioritize their needs and provide opportunities for jobs, education, and economic security. Another challenge facing Mali's youth is the impact of the ongoing conflict and insecurity in the country. The Sahel region, including Mali, is home to some of the most volatile and dangerous conflict zones in the world. Armed groups, including jihadist factions, often target young people, recruiting them for militant activities and exploiting the lack of education and employment as a means to gain new recruits. Many young Malians are caught in a cycle of poverty and insecurity, making them vulnerable to radicalization and violence. The effects of the conflict on young people have been devastating, with many displaced, traumatized, and lacking access to education or healthcare. Furthermore, while youth movements have been pivotal in advocating for political reform, young people are often excluded from decision-making processes and political institutions. The political elites in Mali tend to be older, and youth are frequently sidelined in the national political discourse. As a result, young people's demands for change can be met with resistance, as older generations maintain control over political power and decision-making. For Mali to secure a stable and prosperous future, the inclusion of youth in the political process and the empowerment of civil society will be key components. Addressing the challenges facing young people, particularly in terms of education, employment, and social inclusion, will not only reduce the risk of radicalization and political instability, but also ensure that the country is able to harness the potential of its youthful population. One crucial step forward is improving access to quality education and vocational training for young Malians. Expanding educational opportunities, particularly for girls and young women, is essential for building a more educated and skilled workforce. By investing in education, the government can provide young people with the tools they need to participate in the economy and contribute to the country's growth. Creating more employment opportunities for young people is also critical. This includes fostering an environment that encourages entrepreneurship, supports small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, and addresses the barriers to job creation. The development of the private sector, particularly in agriculture, technology, and services, can provide young Malians with the opportunities they need to build better futures. Mali's foreign policy and its position in the international community have been pivotal in its ongoing efforts to stabilize, rebuild, and position itself within the context of a rapidly changing global order. Since the country's independence, its foreign relations have been influenced by both regional and international dynamics. While its security and political challenges have largely occupied domestic concerns, Mali's external relations remain a significant aspect of its broader strategy for recovery and development. This section will examine Mali's foreign policy since 2016, focusing on its engagement with international powers, regional partners, and multilateral organizations. The country's evolving diplomatic stance, particularly in light of its internal conflicts and military coups, has reshaped its relationships with traditional allies and opened the door to new international engagements. At the same time, the strategic importance of Mali within the Sahel and West African region has led to increasing attention from global powers, all of whom have an interest in the stability of this key country in the heart of Africa. Mali's foreign policy has been shaped by a series of external and internal challenges, particularly since the military coup in 2012 and the subsequent conflicts that ensued. Following the coup, Mali faced international condemnation, and its foreign policy was initially influenced by the need to restore legitimacy and attract foreign support for stabilization efforts. The international community, particularly former colonial powers such as France, played a significant role in providing military, economic, and diplomatic assistance during the crisis. However, the political landscape shifted dramatically after the coup of 2020, when the military once again took control. Under the leadership of the junta, Mali began to redefine its foreign relations, distancing itself from certain traditional partners and seeking to diversify its diplomatic and strategic alliances. The junta, led by Colonel Assimi Goïta, expressed dissatisfaction with France's continued military presence in Mali, marking a significant shift in the country's approach to its former colonial ruler. The withdrawal of French forces from Mali, announced in 2021, was part of a broader reorientation of the country's foreign policy. Mali's new leadership began to pivot toward Russia and other non-Western partners, signaling a willingness to explore alternatives to the West's influence in the region. This pivot has been a subject of significant debate, both within Mali and among the international community. The decision to seek alliances with Russia, particularly through military contracts and diplomatic engagement, has reshaped Mali's relations within the broader international system. Mali's relationship with France has been a cornerstone of its foreign policy since independence. As a former French colony, Mali has long maintained strong political, economic, and military ties with France. France played a crucial role in Mali's recovery after the 2012 coup, leading Operation Serval, which successfully pushed back jihadist groups from northern Mali and stabilized the country. The French military presence in Mali, particularly through Operation Barkhane, has remained a key component of the international effort to combat terrorism in the Sahel region. However, the relationship between Mali and France has soured significantly in recent years. Under the leadership of President Emmanuel Macron, France continued its military operations in the Sahel, but faced mounting criticism from the Malian public and political elites. Many Malians viewed the French military presence as a form of neo-imperialism, and there was growing resentment over France's perceived failure to restore security and fully address the root causes of Mali's conflict. In 2020, the military junta, after taking power, expressed its dissatisfaction with France's involvement in the country's security affairs. The French government's perceived lack of support for the Malian government following the coup, along with the controversial presence of French forces in Mali, led the junta to demand a re-evaluation of their relationship. The situation reached a breaking point in 2021, when the junta announced the withdrawal of French troops from the country, signaling an abrupt end to a decade of military cooperation. The withdrawal of French forces from Mali is seen as a major turning point in the country's foreign policy. While Mali's military leaders have sought to present this decision as an assertion of sovereignty and national pride, it also reflects a broader disillusionment with Western intervention in the Sahel. As the French presence recedes, Mali has sought to diversify its partnerships, particularly with Russia and other non-Western allies, in the hope of securing military assistance and development support without the influence of former colonial powers. Following the military coup in 2020, Mali began to look for new alliances, particularly with Russia. This shift in foreign policy marked a significant departure from Mali's long-standing reliance on France and Western powers. Mali's new leadership sought to establish stronger diplomatic, military, and economic ties with Russia, and Russian mercenaries, most notably the Wagner Group, were reported to have been deployed to Mali to provide security and assist in counterterrorism operations. The engagement with Russia has sparked significant international concern, particularly from France, the United States, and other Western nations, who view the presence of Wagner Group mercenaries as a destabilizing factor in the region. Critics argue that the involvement of Russian mercenaries undermines efforts to promote stability and democracy in Mali, as these groups are often associated with human rights abuses, lack of accountability, and destabilizing activities. However, the Malian junta has defended its engagement with Russia, portraying it as a necessary step to strengthen the country's sovereignty and security in the face of ongoing jihadist threats. Mali's increasing engagement with Russia also reflects the country's broader search for international partners who are willing to support its security and political transition without imposing the same conditions on governance and human rights that Western powers often demand. This shift toward Russia is not only about military cooperation, but also economic opportunities. Russia has expressed interest in investing in Mali's natural resources, particularly in the mining sector, as well as in infrastructure projects. However, the long-term implications of this pivot remain uncertain, as Mali's dependence on Russia could limit its access to Western aid and investments. Despite the growing rift with France, Mali has maintained relations with other international actors, particularly the United States and the United Nations. The United States, which has long been a partner in the fight against terrorism in the Sahel, continues to support Mali's counter-terrorism efforts, particularly through training and financial assistance. The U.S. has provided military aid and has worked with Malian security forces to improve their capacity to combat extremist groups. However, U.S. relations with Mali have become more complicated due to the political instability following the coups and the junta's increasingly authoritarian rule. In response to the military coup and human rights abuses associated with the junta, the United States has imposed sanctions on Mali, including suspending military aid and limiting diplomatic engagement. The U.S. government, while emphasizing the importance of counterterrorism cooperation, has also expressed concerns about Mali's democratic backsliding and its reliance on Russian mercenaries. This has led to tensions in the relationship, as Mali's military junta continues to seek international recognition and legitimacy. The United Nations has also remained a significant partner in Mali, particularly through its peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA. The mission was established to support the Malian government in its efforts to stabilize the country and implement peace agreements. Despite the challenges of operating in a highly insecure environment, MINUSMA has played a critical role in protecting civilians, facilitating humanitarian assistance, and supporting the peace process. However, the continued presence of extremist groups and the complex political situation in Mali have made the success of MINUSMA's mission difficult, and the mission's future remains uncertain as Mali's relationship with international partners evolves. Mali's foreign policy is also heavily influenced by its relationships with its West African neighbors. As a member of the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, Mali has participated in regional diplomatic efforts aimed at promoting stability, economic development, and democratic governance in West Africa. However, Mali's political crises, particularly the coups, have strained its relationships with ECOWAS. In the aftermath of the 2020 coup, ECOWAS imposed sanctions on Mali, including travel bans on leaders of the junta and a suspension of the country's membership in the regional organization. The military junta's decision to extend the transition period and delay elections further fueled tensions with ECOWAS, which has been pressing for a return to civilian rule. ECOWAS has also played a key role in mediating peace agreements and facilitating negotiations between the Malian government and rebel groups, particularly in the context of the Algiers peace agreement. Despite the strained relations, ECOWAS remains an important player in Mali's regional diplomacy and its efforts to reintegrate into the West African community. Mali's relationship with its immediate neighbors, such as Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mauritania, is also crucial for regional stability. The shared security challenges faced by these countries, including jihadist insurgencies and the threat of terrorism, have led to increased cooperation. Mali has participated in joint military operations with its neighbors, particularly through the G5 Sahel initiative, which aims to combat terrorism, drug trafficking, and other forms of transnational crime. These collaborations are vital for maintaining security in the Sahel and ensuring that Mali remains a key partner in regional security efforts. Mali's foreign policy in the coming years will need to strike a delicate balance between maintaining national sovereignty, pursuing international support for security and development, and navigating the complex geopolitical environment. The evolving relationship with Russia, the continued importance of international partners like the United States and the United Nations, and the role of regional organizations like ECOWAS will all play a significant part in shaping Mali's foreign policy. Mali, like many other countries in the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa, is facing the profound effects of climate change, which have exacerbated the existing challenges of poverty, food security, and political instability. The country, predominantly reliant on agriculture, is particularly vulnerable to the unpredictable weather patterns, desertification, and extreme weather events that characterize a changing climate. In addition to the direct environmental consequences, these changes are influencing the social, economic, and security dynamics of the country, further complicating the path towards stability and development. This section examines the environmental challenges Mali faces as a result of climate change, the impact of these changes on its agriculture, economy, and population, and how these issues intersect with the country's political and security concerns. Additionally, we will explore the strategies Mali is adopting, with the help of international partners, to mitigate and adapt to climate change, while considering the broader implications for the Sahel region and the country's long-term sustainability. The Sahel region, which spans across parts of Africa just south of the Sahara Desert, is one of the areas most affected by climate change. This region already faces harsh climatic conditions characterized by droughts, unpredictable rainfall, and extreme temperatures. Climate change is intensifying these conditions, creating a vicious cycle of environmental degradation that affects millions of people in Mali and its neighboring countries. Mali's climate is classified as semi-arid, and the country experiences high temperatures, with rain-fed agriculture being the backbone of the economy. The rainfall patterns are becoming increasingly erratic, with periods of prolonged droughts followed by heavy downpours that lead to flooding. This unpredictability has made it difficult for farmers to plan and grow crops effectively, with devastating consequences for food production. The northern parts of the country, which are already prone to desertification, are experiencing a worsening trend, while the southern regions are not immune to the impacts of irregular rainfall. For a country like Mali, where approximately 70% of the population relies on agriculture for their livelihoods, the stakes of climate change are extremely high. The growing unpredictability of the climate is not only affecting crop yields, but also the availability of water resources, which are vital for agriculture, livestock, and daily life. Agriculture is central to Mali's economy, and climate change is already having a profound impact on food security. Mali's primary agricultural products include cereals, such as millet, sorghum, and maize, cotton, and rice, all of which depend on rainfall patterns. The increasing frequency of droughts and irregular rainy seasons disrupt the growing cycle, leading to decreased agricultural productivity. This, in turn, reduces the availability of food, exacerbates poverty, and increases the risk of food insecurity for millions of Malians. In addition to the direct impact on crop yields, changes in rainfall patterns and rising temperatures also contribute to soil erosion, desertification, and the depletion of water sources. These environmental challenges make it increasingly difficult for farmers, particularly those in the country's more arid regions, to maintain their livelihoods. Without sufficient rainfall, farmers struggle to grow the crops that are essential to their survival and the survival of their communities. The situation is particularly dire for rural communities that rely on subsistence farming. When crop yields decrease, food prices rise, and vulnerable populations, particularly children and the elderly, are most affected by malnutrition. The growing threat of food insecurity is further exacerbated by the displacement of communities, as people flee areas that can no longer support agricultural activities. This displacement has social and economic implications, as entire communities are forced to adapt to new regions where access to resources is limited. Climate-induced shifts in agriculture are also affecting livestock production, which is another important part of Mali's economy, particularly in the north and central regions. Pastoralism, which involves the herding of cattle, sheep, and goats, is a traditional livelihood that is highly dependent on water sources and grazing land. The reduced availability of water due to climate change is leading to conflicts between farmers and pastoralists, as both groups compete for increasingly scarce resources. These tensions, combined with the growing insecurity caused by extremist groups, create a volatile environment that makes it even harder for local communities to maintain their traditional livelihoods. Desertification, or the process by which fertile land becomes desert as a result of drought, deforestation, and inappropriate land management, is another major environmental issue for Mali. The northern regions, which are already prone to desertification, are suffering from increasing land degradation. As the desert expands, it encroaches on arable land, reducing the amount of usable land available for farming and grazing. This further exacerbates Mali's food security crisis, particularly in areas that were once productive. One of the key causes of desertification in Mali is the overexploitation of natural resources, particularly the overgrazing of land by livestock and the cutting of trees for fuel. The loss of vegetation, which helps to retain moisture and protect the soil from erosion, accelerates the desertification process. Additionally, the expanding human population in rural areas, coupled with inadequate land management practices, puts further strain on the environment. Mali's government and various international organizations have recognized the severity of desertification and are working on several initiatives to combat land degradation. Programs that focus on sustainable land management, reforestation, and improving agricultural practices are central to these efforts. However, the sheer scale of the challenge and the lack of resources and technical capacity in rural areas make progress slow. Addressing desertification requires not only local interventions, but also coordinated regional and international efforts. Access to water is another pressing issue in Mali, which has experienced significant water shortages due to climate change. The availability of water is essential for both agriculture and human consumption, and Mali has relied heavily on the Niger River for its water needs. However, increasing evaporation due to rising temperatures, coupled with erratic rainfall, has led to fluctuations in river water levels, threatening Mali's water security. In northern Mali, where water resources are already scarce, the situation is particularly dire. The region's reliance on seasonal rains and groundwater has made it vulnerable to fluctuations in rainfall and changes in groundwater recharge rates. As water sources dry up or become more polluted, local communities face increasing difficulties in accessing safe drinking water, which leads to a rise in waterborne diseases and further strains the already fragile healthcare system. Mali's government has been working to address water scarcity by investing in infrastructure projects aimed at improving water access in rural and remote areas. Efforts to construct new wells, dams, and water purification systems are essential to improving the resilience of communities. However, water scarcity is not a challenge that can be solved by infrastructure alone. It requires long-term solutions that incorporate water conservation, sustainable resource management, and regional cooperation to address the larger transboundary water issues that affect Mali and its neighbors. The relationship between environmental stress and conflict is becoming increasingly apparent in Mali. The strain on natural resources, such as water and arable land, exacerbates existing social and political tensions, particularly between ethnic groups and between farmers and herders. As climate change accelerates desertification, reduces agricultural productivity, and increases competition for resources, the risk of conflict intensifies. Mali has witnessed an uptick in violence in areas that have been most affected by environmental degradation. For example, in the central and northern regions, competition for land and water between farmers and pastoralists has contributed to intercommunal violence. Extremist groups, such as those affiliated with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, have also exploited these tensions, fueling ethnic and regional divisions to gain support for their cause. The armed groups take advantage of the vulnerable populations that are forced to migrate due to resource scarcity, often offering them protection or recruitment opportunities in exchange for support. Moreover, the displacement of people caused by environmental stress, whether due to drought, desertification, or flooding, has exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in Mali. As people flee areas where they can no longer farm or access water, they move to already crowded urban centers or neighboring countries, putting additional pressure on already strained resources and contributing to social instability. This displacement also makes it difficult for local authorities to provide adequate services to those in need, as resources become more scarce and access to affected areas becomes more difficult. To address the environmental challenges that climate change presents, Mali is working alongside international partners to implement adaptation and mitigation strategies. These strategies aim to reduce the impact of climate change on Mali's environment, economy, and society, while also building resilience against future environmental shocks. One of the key strategies for adaptation is sustainable agricultural practices. Efforts are being made to promote climate-smart agriculture, which includes techniques such as crop diversification, improved irrigation systems, and the use of drought-resistant crops. These practices help farmers adapt to changing rainfall patterns and ensure food security. The government is also encouraging the use of agroforestry and other methods that integrate trees and crops to improve soil fertility and water retention. In terms of mitigation, Mali is working on reforestation programs to combat desertification and restore degraded land. These efforts are aimed at reversing the damage caused by deforestation and promoting sustainable land use. Furthermore, renewable energy initiatives such as solar energy projects are being explored to reduce the country's dependence on biomass and fossil fuels, both of which contribute to environmental degradation. International organizations such as the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, and the World Bank are partnering with the Malian government to provide financial and technical support for these initiatives. International donors have committed to supporting Mali's climate change adaptation efforts, particularly in the agricultural and water sectors. However, the scale of the challenge requires greater funding and international cooperation, as well as a long-term commitment from all stakeholders. Mali's environmental challenges, exacerbated by climate change, are inseparable from its broader political, economic, and security challenges. The country's future depends on its ability to build resilience in the face of environmental stress, while addressing the root causes of instability. Climate change is not just an environmental issue. It is a social, economic, and political issue that affects all aspects of Mali's development. The road to lasting peace and national reconciliation in Mali has been a long and difficult one. The complex interplay of political instability, insecurity, ethnic divisions, economic hardships, and environmental stress has left deep scars on the country. While there have been significant strides in rebuilding and recovery since the coup of 2012, the journey toward true national reconciliation and long-term stability remains a challenging task. The success of Mali's future will depend on its ability to heal the divisions within its society, address the root causes of conflict, and foster a sense of unity among its diverse populations. This section will explore the ongoing efforts toward national reconciliation in Mali, the obstacles that remain, and the role of both the Malian government and civil society in achieving peace and stability. We will also examine the broader regional and international context in which these efforts are taking place, and the role that both internal and external actors play in shaping the country's future. One of the key steps in Mali's post-coup political recovery was the signing of the Algiers Peace Agreement in 2015. The agreement, which was negotiated between the Malian government, northern rebel groups, and international mediators, aimed to bring an end to the conflict between the government and the various armed groups that had been fighting for greater autonomy in the northern regions. The agreement included provisions for decentralization, greater autonomy for the northern regions, the integration of rebel fighters into the national army, and the establishment of a more inclusive political system. The Algiers Peace Agreement represented a significant milestone in the peace process, as it marked the first time that the Malian government and the northern rebels had come to the table to negotiate a comprehensive settlement. It also highlighted the international community's commitment to Mali's stability, with the United Nations, Algeria, France, and other partners playing crucial roles in the mediation process. However, while the agreement was a promising step forward, its implementation has been slow and fraught with difficulties. One of the main challenges has been the lack of trust between the Malian government and the rebel groups, particularly regarding the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of former fighters. There have been delays in the creation of the necessary structures for reintegration, and the process has often been hampered by the ongoing security situation in the north. The continued presence of jihadist groups in the region has further complicated the situation, as these groups frequently undermine efforts to stabilize the area and prevent the full implementation of the peace agreement. Additionally, the process of decentralization, which was intended to give more autonomy to the northern regions, has been slow to materialize. Local governance structures have not been fully established, and the lack of effective governance in many areas has led to frustrations among local populations, who feel excluded from the political process. The inability to establish functioning local governments in these areas has perpetuated a sense of marginalization and has undermined efforts to build trust between the state and local communities. Despite these challenges, the Algiers Peace Agreement remains a crucial foundation for peace in Mali. For the country to move forward, the agreement must be fully implemented, and both the government and the various rebel groups must make a genuine commitment to the process of reconciliation and reintegration. This will require overcoming significant political, social, and security challenges, but it is an essential step toward long-term stability. In addition to the Algiers Peace Agreement, national dialogue has been a critical component of Mali's efforts toward reconciliation. Since the military coup of 2012, there has been a concerted effort to bring together various political, social, and ethnic groups to foster a sense of unity and rebuild trust in the country's democratic institutions. The process of national dialogue has been a complex and sometimes contentious one, as Mali is home to a diverse population with a wide range of political and regional interests. The national dialogue process, which has been supported by both the government and international partners, aims to address the grievances of different ethnic groups, particularly the Tuareg and other populations in the north, who have long felt marginalized by the central government. The dialogue has focused on issues such as decentralization, resource distribution, cultural rights, and political representation. It has also sought to address the historical and political roots of the conflict, including the challenges posed by ethnic divisions, religious tensions, and regional disparities. However, the national dialogue process has not been without its difficulties. One of the main challenges has been the lack of political will on the part of the government to fully engage with opposition groups and civil society. There have been concerns that the government is more focused on maintaining control and power than on making the necessary reforms to address the underlying causes of conflict. The dialogue process has often been criticized for excluding key groups, particularly those that are not represented in the political elite, and for failing to produce concrete results. The political reform process is similarly fraught with challenges. Mali's political system, while based on a democratic framework, remains weak, with entrenched corruption, limited public accountability, and a lack of transparency. The continued dominance of a few political elites has left many Malians feeling disconnected from the political process, and efforts to reform the political system and strengthen democratic institutions have faced significant resistance. For Mali to achieve lasting reconciliation, it will need to strengthen its democratic institutions, ensure that all voices are heard, and address the systemic issues of corruption and inefficiency. This will require genuine political will from both the government and opposition parties, as well as the involvement of civil society organizations and local communities in the process of reform. Mali's civil society has been at the forefront of efforts to foster national reconciliation and peace-building in the country. Civil society organizations, including human rights groups, women's organizations, and local community groups, have played an essential role in advocating for political reforms, holding the government accountable, and promoting dialogue between different communities. These organizations have been particularly active in pushing for the inclusion of marginalized groups, including women, youth, and rural communities, in the peace process. One of the most significant challenges for civil society in Mali is navigating the political environment, which has been characterized by military coups, political repression, and ongoing security challenges. Civil society organizations often face significant obstacles, including government resistance, limited resources, and the threat of violence. Despite these challenges, civil society remains a vital player in the country's efforts to rebuild and reconcile. Youth engagement has also become a critical element in Mali's reconciliation process. With nearly half of the country's population under the age of 25, young people represent both the future of Mali and a critical force for change. In recent years, young Malians have increasingly become involved in political movements, social advocacy, and efforts to address the country's pressing challenges. The youth population, which is disproportionately affected by unemployment, lack of education, and insecurity, has the potential to drive the country toward a more inclusive democratic future. The role of young people in Mali's national reconciliation process has been particularly evident in the political protests that have occurred since the 2020 coup. Many of the most vocal supporters of the opposition have been young Malians who are demanding political reform, better governance, and a more inclusive political system. Their engagement in the political process is crucial for ensuring that Mali's future is one in which all voices are heard and represented. Mali's efforts toward reconciliation and stability have been significantly influenced by international actors who have provided political, financial, and military support. The United Nations, the European Union, the United States, and France have all been involved in supporting Mali's peace process through diplomatic initiatives, peacekeeping missions, and development assistance. The international community has played a key role in providing the necessary resources for the implementation of the Algiers peace agreement and in supporting the Malian government's efforts to address the security and humanitarian crises. However, international involvement has not been without its challenges. The military coup of 2020, which led to Mali's suspension from the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the imposition of sanctions, strained Mali's relations with its international partners. The international community has expressed concerns about the Malian junta's commitment to the peace process and its failure to meet its promises to return to civilian rule. At the same time, the ongoing security situation in the country, including the presence of jihadist groups and armed militias, has made it difficult to achieve lasting peace. Despite these challenges, international actors remain committed to supporting Mali's peace-building efforts. The continued involvement of the United Nations, France, and other international partners is essential for ensuring that Mali receives the support it needs to address its security and political challenges. However, this support must be aligned with Mali's long-term goals of self-determination, sovereignty, and democratic governance. The road to national reconciliation in Mali is long and fraught with obstacles. The country's political, economic, and security challenges are deeply intertwined, and achieving lasting peace will require addressing the root causes of conflict, including ethnic tensions, regional disparities, and historical grievances. Strengthening democratic institutions, promoting inclusivity, and fostering dialogue between different communities will be essential for creating a stable and prosperous future. The Algiers Peace Agreement, national dialogue, and civil society engagement are crucial components of Mali's path toward reconciliation. However, progress will depend on the political will of the government, the commitment of opposition groups, and the active involvement of local communities. For Mali to move forward, it must prioritize the needs and aspirations of its people, particularly the youth and marginalized groups, and ensure that all Malians have a stake in the country's future. Mali's future will be shaped by its ability to reconcile its past with its present and to build a more inclusive, democratic society. The challenges are immense, but the resilience of the Malian people, the engagement of civil society, and the support of international partners offer hope for a peaceful and prosperous future. As Mali navigates its path toward national reconciliation, the lessons learned from past struggles will guide the country toward a more stable and unified future.